Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in Oregon's Three Sisters Wilderness, during what was supposed to be a simple reunion hike with my college friends. I should have known something was wrong when Jake's GPS started glitching before we even reached the trailhead. The device kept showing our location as somewhere in the middle of South Sisters Crater Lake, despite us being clearly on Highway 242. Jake laughed it off. He always laughed off the things that made the rest of us nervous. That was Jake's way. Barrel forward, deal with problems when they became unavoidable. "Technology, man," he said, tossing the GPS into his pack. "We've got paper maps. We're not exactly scaling Everest here." The four of us had met during our sophomore year at University of Oregon, thrown together in a shared house that smelled perpetually of Jake's protein shakes and Tyler's darkroom chemicals. Now, 6 years later, we were scattered across the country. Jake in Seattle working construction, Sarah finishing her medical residency in Portland, Tyler freelancing as a photographer in San Francisco, and me writing code for a startup in Austin. This trip was Sarah's idea, a way to reconnect before life pulled us even further apart. Looking back, I wonder if the thing in the woods had been watching us even then, measuring our friendship, calculating which of us would be easiest to take. The parking area at the Mackenzie Pass trailhead was nearly empty, just our rented Subaru and a Forest Service truck. October in the Cascades meant most fair-weather hikers had already packed away their gear for the season. The aspens were turning gold against the darker backdrop of Douglas firs, and the air carried that sharp, clean scent that only comes with altitude and approaching winter. Tyler was already snapping photos, his expensive camera clicking softly as he captured the way morning light filtered through the canopy. He'd always been the artistic one among us, the one who noticed details the rest of us missed. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he crouched to photograph a fallen log carpeted with moss. "This light is incredible," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "The way it hits the fog, it's like the forest is breathing." Sarah hefted her pack, checking the straps for the third time. Everything about Sarah was precise, from the way she organized her medical supplies to the careful manner she spoke when uncertain about something. She'd always been our voice of reason, the one who insisted we check weather reports and carry emergency beacons. "We should start moving," she said, consulting her watch. "I want to reach the campsite before afternoon storms roll in." Jake was already shouldering his massive pack, loaded down with enough gear to survive a week instead of our planned 3 days. He was the type who prepared for every contingency except the ones that actually happened. "Lead the way, Dr. Chen," he said with a grin. The trail started easy, a gentle climb through second-growth forest where logging operations decades ago had left wide clearings now filled with young trees. We fell into our old rhythm without thinking about it. Jake setting pace up front, Sarah behind him consulting her map, Tyler stopping frequently to photograph interesting formations, and me bringing up the rear, fighting the familiar knot of anxiety that always accompanied me into unfamiliar places. I'd been an anxious kid, the type who checked under beds and inside closets before sleep. Middle school had been particularly brutal, a growth spurt that left me gangly and uncoordinated, an easy target for the sort of casual cruelty that thrives in teenage hierarchies. The anxiety never fully went away, just learned to hide itself better. In familiar environments, I could forget about it for hours at a time, but here, surrounded by thousands of acres of wilderness, it crept back like fog rolling in from the coast. "You okay back there, Mike?" Jake called over his shoulder. "Fine," I said, adjusting my pack straps. "Just finding my rhythm." The first strange thing happened around noon. We'd stopped for lunch beside a small creek that wasn't marked on any of our maps. Sarah spread out the topographical map, running her finger along the blue lines that indicated water sources. "This should be Surprise Creek," she said, but according to this, we're still 1.5 miles away from it. Jake knelt beside the water, cupping his hands to drink. Maybe the map's off. These things aren't always perfect. Maps don't just invent creeks, Jake. Tyler was photographing the water where it pooled behind a small dam of fallen branches. Does it matter? He asked. Water's water, and this place is beautiful. He was right about that. Sunlight danced on the surface of the pool, and the sound of running water mixed with the whisper of wind through pine needles. It should have been peaceful. Instead, I found myself studying the tree line, searching for movement that wasn't there. Mike's got that look again, Jake said, noticing my scanning. What's wrong, man? Nothing, I said quickly. Just, does anyone else think it's too quiet? They paused to listen. Birds called from the canopy above us, and something small rustled through undergrowth on the far side of the creek. Normal forest sounds. Sounds fine to me, Sarah said, but Tyler lowered his camera, head tilted. Actually, there's something off about the bird calls. They're all coming from the same direction, like they're following us. Birds don't follow people, Sarah said with the tone she used when Tyler's imagination ran away with him. These ones might, Tyler said quietly. We resumed hiking, but I noticed Tyler glancing frequently over his shoulder. The anxiety in my chest tightened another notch. The afternoon brought our first real glimpse of what we'd come to see. A vista point where the trail emerged from thick forest onto an exposed ridge. The Three Sisters peaks rose before us like granite monuments, their snow-covered summits gleaming against a sky that had turned the color of old pewter. North and Middle Sister stood close together, connected by a saddle of broken rock. South Sister, the tallest and most recently active, loomed to our left with its perfect volcanic cone. Jesus, Jake breathed. Photos don't do it justice. Tyler was already working, moving along the ridge to find the perfect angle. The wind up here was stronger, carrying the scent of snow from the peaks. Sarah consulted her altimeter. 7,200 feet, she announced. We've gained about 1,500 feet since this morning. Feels like more, I said, slightly out of breath despite being in decent shape. Altitude affects people differently, Sarah said. You feeling okay? Headache? Nausea? I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. Something about this place made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the peaks seemed to lean over us, creating an optical illusion that we were standing at the bottom of a vast bowl. Or maybe it was the silence that settled whenever the wind died, a complete absence of sound that felt unnatural. Tyler rejoined us, camera hanging around his neck. We should keep moving. Those clouds look serious. He was right. While we'd been admiring the view, a line of dark clouds had built up behind North Sister. They moved with unnatural speed, boiling upward like smoke from a fire. Storms coming in fast, Sarah said, already shouldering her pack. We need to get below tree line. The descent was steep and treacherous, made worse by loose rocks that shifted underfoot. More than once I had to grab a tree trunk to keep from sliding. The approaching storm turned the afternoon air electric. I could feel it raising the hair on my arms. We reached our planned campsite just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The clearing was smaller than expected, barely large enough for our 2 tents, but it was sheltered by tall pines and positioned near what our map indicated was a reliable water source. This'll have to do, Jake said, already pulling his tent from his pack. We worked quickly as the rain intensified. Sarah and I shared a 2-person tent while Jake and Tyler each had their own single-person shelters. By the time we had everything set up, the storm was raging in earnest, driving rain that struck the tent fly like thrown gravel, and wind that made the whole structure shudder. So much for a campfire tonight, Tyler said as we huddled in my and Sarah's tent, eating cold sandwiches and trail mix. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark black and white, followed by thunder that seemed to roll on forever through the peaks. In those brief, bright moments, I caught glimpses of the trees around our camp. Tall sentinels swaying in the wind, their branches reaching toward our small circle of safety. Anyone want to hear a ghost story? Jake asked with forced cheerfulness. Absolutely not, Sarah said immediately. Come on, it's tradition. Camping trip isn't complete without at least one good scare. This place is scary enough without your help, I said. Tyler looked up from his camera where he'd been reviewing the day's photos on the small LCD screen. Actually, there is something weird about this area. I was reading about it before we came. The Three Sisters Wilderness has one of the highest disappearance rates in Oregon. Tyler, Sarah warned. I'm serious. People go missing here more often than in other wilderness areas. Usually solo hikers, but not always. And when they find them, if they find them, they're often in places that don't make sense. Like miles away from any trail, in terrain no sane person would try to cross. Lightning flashed again, and in the momentary brightness I saw something move between the trees. Or thought I did. When darkness returned, I stared at the spot until my eyes watered, but saw nothing. There was this one case, Tyler continued, oblivious to my discomfort, from about 10 years ago. A family of 4 camping near Obsidian Falls. The parents and one kid were found dead in their tent. No signs of violence, no obvious cause of death. But the youngest daughter, maybe 8 years old, was missing. Search and rescue combed the area for weeks. Did they find her? Jake asked. Yeah, 3 months later, about 15 miles north near the Mackenzie River. Alive. That's good, right? Sarah said uncertainly. She couldn't remember anything about where she'd been or how she'd survived. Wouldn't speak for almost a year after they found her. When she finally started talking again, she kept insisting that her real family was still out there in the woods, waiting for her. The tent fell silent except for the drum of rain on nylon. Outside, the wind howled through the trees with a sound like distant voices. That's enough stories for tonight, Sarah said firmly. We settled into our sleeping bags, but sleep was elusive. The storm raged until well past midnight, and even after it passed, the forest remained restless. Trees creaked and groaned, releasing the stress of bent branches. Water dripped from pine needles with a regular rhythm that almost sounded like footsteps. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time a branch snapped or the wind gusted. In my half-dreams, I kept hearing Tyler's voice telling that story about the missing girl, except in the dream it wasn't Tyler speaking. It was something else, something that had learned to mimic his voice. I woke to pale dawn light filtering through the tent's yellow fabric. Sarah was already stirring, checking her watch with the mechanical precision that marked all her movements. 6:30, she murmured. Storms passed. Outside, I could hear Jake moving around, probably trying to get a fire started. Tyler's tent was silent, but that didn't surprise me. He'd always been the last to wake up during college. Sarah and I dressed quickly in the cramped confines of the tent, then crawled outside to survey the damage. The storm had been worse than I'd realized. Branches littered the campsite, and a large pine had fallen across the trail we'd used to reach this clearing. The air smelled of rain and pine sap and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made my stomach turn. Jake was crouched beside a circle of stones, trying to coax life from a pile of damp kindling. His hair stuck up at odd angles, and his eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Coffee, he said by way of greeting. I need coffee or I'm going to die. Good morning to you too, Sarah said with a slight smile. Sleep well? Like shit. You? About the same. I walked over to Tyler's tent, intending to wake him, but stopped when I noticed the zipper. It was pulled completely shut from the outside, which would be impossible if Tyler were inside. The tent's rainfly hung loose and one of the guy lines had come undone during the storm. Hey, Tyler, I called softly, not wanting to startle him if he was still asleep. No response. I tried again, louder. Tyler, you okay in there? Still nothing. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. I reached for the zipper with hands that had begun to shake. The tent was empty. Tyler's sleeping bag lay unzipped and thrown aside. His clothes from yesterday were gone, but his camera, his expensive, precious camera that he never went anywhere without, sat abandoned on the tent floor. "Jake," I called, my voice higher than I intended. "Sarah, he's gone." They rushed over, Sarah pushing past me to look inside the tent. Her medical training kicked in immediately, and she began searching for clues with the systematic thoroughness of someone accustomed to solving problems. "His boots are gone," she said, "and his jacket. But everything else is here: camera, wallet, phone." "Maybe he went to take sunrise photos," Jake suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Without his camera?" I said. We called Tyler's name, our voices echoing off the peaks. Birds answered from the canopy above, but nothing else. The forest felt enormous around us, full of places a person could disappear forever. "We should split up," Jake said. "Cover more ground." "No," Sarah said immediately. "Bad idea. We stay together. If something happened to Tyler—" She didn't finish the thought, but we all understood. In wilderness rescue scenarios, the worst thing you can do is create more victims by acting recklessly. We spent the morning searching in an expanding spiral around our campsite, calling Tyler's name until our voices grew hoarse. I found myself studying the ground for footprints, but the storm had washed away any tracks. The forest seemed to mock our efforts, offering false hope in the form of colored clothing that turned out to be autumn leaves, or distant movements that proved to be shadows cast by wind-blown branches. By noon, Sarah made the decision I'd been dreading. "We need to get to higher ground and try the satellite communicator," she said. "If we can't reach Tyler in the next few hours, we're calling for help." The communicator was our emergency backup, a device that could send messages via satellite when cell phone coverage was non-existent. Sarah had insisted we bring it, despite Jake's protests that we were being overcautious. We climbed back toward the ridge where we'd admired the peaks yesterday. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind air so clean and clear it almost hurt to breathe. Snow had fallen on the higher peaks during the night, making them gleam like polished steel. Sarah powered up the communicator and held it skyward, waiting for the device to acquire satellite signals. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. "Come on," she muttered. "Come on." "Sarah." Jake's voice was strange, tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "What?" "Look." He was pointing down the ridge toward a stand of aspens about a quarter-mile away. Even from this distance I could see someone moving between the trees, a figure in dark clothing, walking with the careful gait of someone navigating rough terrain. "Tyler!" I shouted, waving my arms above my head. The figure stopped and turned toward us. Even at this distance there was something wrong with the way it moved. Too fluid, like water flowing uphill. "Tyler, stay there. We're coming to you." We half ran, half slid down the loose scree slope, calling his name. But when we reached the stand of aspens, there was no one there. The trees stood silent and still, their golden leaves catching sunlight like scattered coins. "He was here," Jake insisted. "We all saw him." "Maybe he heard us calling and went back toward camp," Sarah suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. We searched the aspen grove thoroughly, looking for any sign that Tyler had been there. I found myself growing increasingly agitated, checking the same areas multiple times, convinced I was missing something obvious. That's when Sarah grabbed my arm. "Mike, look at this." She was crouched beside one of the larger aspen trees, studying something carved into the pale bark. At first I thought it was just natural scarring, the kind of marks that develop when branches break off or animals claw at the trunk. But as I looked closer, I realized the marks formed letters. H-E-L-P, carved deep into the living wood. But the bark around the carving had already begun to heal over, forming thick scar tissue that would take months or years to develop. The carving was old, far older than Tyler's disappearance. "That's impossible," Jake said when we showed him. "We saw him this morning. He couldn't have carved this." "Maybe it's from someone else," Sarah said. "Another missing hiker." But even as she said it, I could see she didn't believe it. The carving was too fresh, too precisely formed. And underneath the larger letters, someone had scratched smaller marks that looked almost like Tyler's photography signature, the way he initialed his prints. We stood in the aspen grove for a long time, trying to make sense of what we'd found. The rational part of my mind searched for logical explanations. Coincidence, pareidolia, stress-induced hallucinations. But the anxious part, the part that had been whispering warnings since we'd entered the forest, knew we were dealing with something that didn't follow rational rules. "We need to get back to camp," Sarah said finally. "Try the communicator again." The hike back felt longer than it should have, as if the forest had stretched while we were away. Shadows fell at wrong angles, and more than once I had the sensation that we were walking in circles despite following an obvious trail. When we finally reached our campsite, the sun was already sinking toward the western peaks. Sarah tried the communicator again, moving to different positions around the clearing to find a signal. On the third attempt, the device chirped to indicate successful satellite contact. "Thank God," she breathed, typing rapidly on the small keypad. The message was simple. "Hiker missing. 3 Sisters Wilderness. Need SR. GPS coordinates follow." She sent our location and a brief description of Tyler's disappearance, then settled back to wait for a response. Emergency services in wilderness areas could take hours to coordinate rescue efforts, especially as evening approached. "We should set up a signal fire," Jake said. "Make it easier for them to spot us." We gathered dry wood from the forest floor, building a pile in the center of the clearing that we could light quickly if we heard aircraft overhead. The physical activity helped combat the helpless feeling that had been growing all day, but it couldn't shake the certainty that something was watching us from the tree line. As darkness approached, we made dinner from our remaining supplies, instant soup heated over Jake's small camping stove. The meal was tasteless, more obligation than nourishment. None of us felt much like eating, but Sarah insisted we maintain our strength. "SAR will probably start at first light," she said. "They'll want to interview us, get a detailed timeline of Tyler's movements. We need to be ready to help however we can." "What do you think happened to him?" Jake asked. It was the question we'd all been avoiding. Sarah considered her words carefully before answering. "Best case, he got disoriented in the storm, maybe hit his head on a branch. He's holed up somewhere waiting for help. We'll find him dehydrated and embarrassed, but otherwise fine." "And worst case?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Bear attack. Fall from a cliff. Exposure." She paused. "There are a lot of ways to die out here." Jake started to ask another question, but I held up my hand for silence. In the growing darkness beyond our camp, something was moving through the undergrowth, something large enough to break branches as it moved. We sat frozen, listening to the sound of careful footsteps circling our clearing. The steps were too deliberate to be an animal, too quiet to be a search and rescue team. "Tyler," Jake called tentatively. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, from the darkness at the edge of our camp, Tyler's voice answered, "I'm here." But it wasn't Tyler's voice. Not exactly. The words were right, the tone familiar, but something fundamental was wrong. It was like hearing someone speak through water, or from the bottom of a well. "Tyler, thank God," Sarah said, standing up. "We've been looking for you all day. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," the voice said. "Just got turned around in the storm." A figure emerged from the tree line, moving into the circle of light cast by our camping lantern. It was Tyler, same dark hair, same lean build, same clothes he'd been wearing yesterday. But even in the dim light, I could see that something was wrong. His skin had a waxy pallor that made him look like he'd been underwater for hours. His eyes didn't reflect the lantern light the way they should have, remaining flat and black even when he looked directly at the bulb. And when he smiled, that familiar crooked grin that had charmed professors and coffee shop baristas throughout college, his teeth seemed too sharp. "Where have you been?" Jake demanded. "We've been worried sick." "I told you," Tyler said, settling down beside the cold fire pit. "Got lost in the storm, found a cave to wait it out." "What cave?" Sarah asked. "We've been searching all day. We didn't see any caves." Tyler's head turned toward her with mechanical precision, like a camera on a tripod. "There are lots of caves up here. You just have to know where to look." I found myself staring at his hands as he reached for his water bottle. The fingernails were too long and the skin around them was stained dark, not with dirt, but with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Tyler," I said carefully, "where's your camera?" He paused in the act of unscrewing the bottle cap. For just a moment, his face went completely blank. Not confused, but empty, like someone had turned off the lights behind his eyes. "My camera?" "Yeah, you left it in your tent. You never go anywhere without it." "I forgot it." The words came out slowly, as if he was translating from another language. "Was in a hurry." Sarah was studying him with the clinical intensity she brought to medical examinations. I could see her cataloging the details that weren't quite right. The pallor, the strange eye movement, the way he seemed to be consciously controlling his breathing. "Tyler, I want you to tell me what day it is," she said. "Tuesday." "What month?" Another pause. "October." "What year?" The pause stretched longer this time. When Tyler finally answered, his voice had lost all inflection. "I don't remember." Jake laughed nervously. "Come on, man. It's 2023. You hit your head or something?" But Sarah wasn't laughing. She'd moved closer to Tyler, close enough to examine him in the lantern light. What she saw made her take a sharp step backward. "That's not Tyler," she said quietly. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded. "Of course it's Tyler." "Look at his neck." We all looked. Just below Tyler's left ear, partially hidden by his collar, was a ragged wound that looked like a bite mark. The edges were black with infection or something worse, and the skin around it had taken on a mottled, greenish hue. "Tyler," Sarah said, her voice taking on the calm authority she used in medical emergencies, "I need you to let me examine that wound." The thing wearing Tyler's face turned toward her, and for the first time since it had emerged from the trees, it smiled. It was a horrible expression, too wide, showing too many teeth. "I'm fine," it said, but its voice was changing, becoming layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. And as it spoke, I noticed that its breath was visible in the cool night air. Not the normal puffs of warm vapor, but something darker, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "That's not Tyler," Sarah repeated, backing toward our tent. "That's not him." The Tyler thing tilted its head, studying her with those flat, black eyes. "Of course I'm Tyler. Don't you recognize me?" "Prove it," Jake said, though I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Tell us something only Tyler would know." "I know that you failed organic chemistry twice," the thing said, looking at Sarah. "I know that Jake pretends to like craft beer but actually prefers Bud Light. I know that Mike still sleeps with a nightlight because he's afraid of the dark." The last observation hit me like a physical blow. Tyler did know about my nightlight. I'd been embarrassed when he discovered it during a visit to my apartment last year. But the way the thing said it, with casual cruelty rather than friendly teasing, was all wrong. "Tyler wouldn't say it like that," I said. The thing's smile widened impossibly, splitting its face in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. "Wouldn't I?" That's when I noticed the smell, the same organic sweetness I'd detected that morning, but stronger now. It was the smell of decomposition, of meat left too long in the sun. Sarah had reached our tent and was fumbling for something in her pack. Jake stood frozen halfway between me and the Tyler thing, paralyzed by indecision. The rational part of his mind was probably still insisting that this was his friend, despite the mounting evidence to the contrary. "Jake," I said softly, not taking my eyes off the thing by the fire pit. "Get away from it." But Jake was studying the Tyler thing's face, searching for some trace of the person he'd known since college. "Tyler, what happened to you out there? What did this to you?" The thing's head snapped toward Jake with predatory focus. When it spoke, its voice was no longer trying to mimic Tyler's. It had become something else entirely, something that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "I found what was waiting for me," it said. "What's been waiting for all of you." Sarah emerged from the tent holding her emergency flare, a handheld device designed to signal rescue aircraft. She pulled the ignition tab, and brilliant red light flooded the campsite. In that harsh illumination, we could see the Tyler thing clearly for the first time. The illusion of humanity fell away like a discarded mask. Its skin was mottled and gray, stretched too tight over bones that had elongated beyond human proportions. The wound on its neck wasn't a bite mark, it was a gaping hole that seemed to go all the way through to the other side, and its eyes were holes in reality, offering glimpses of something vast and hungry that existed in the spaces between trees. "Run," Sarah said. We ran. I've never moved so fast in my life, crashing through underbrush that tore at my clothes and skin. Behind us, the thing that had been Tyler, or that was wearing Tyler like an ill-fitting suit, gave pursuit. I could hear it moving through the forest with impossible speed, breaking branches that should have stopped any human-sized creature, but it wasn't making Tyler's sounds anymore. The noises coming from its throat were animal sounds, wet, guttural calls that seemed designed to disorient prey. And underneath those sounds, barely audible above our crashing flight, I could hear Tyler's voice calling for help, as if the real Tyler was trapped somewhere inside that corrupted shell. We had no destination, no plan beyond getting away from the thing behind us. The forest at night was a maze of shadows and obstacles, and more than once I stumbled over hidden roots or low-hanging branches. Sarah's flare cast everything in hellish red light that made the trees look like skeletal fingers reaching for us. "This way," Jake gasped, angling toward what looked like a game trail. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding between moss-covered boulders and fallen logs. But it was easier going than the thick underbrush, and we made better time. The sounds of pursuit faded slightly, though I wasn't sure if that meant we were outdistancing our pursuer, or if it had simply changed tactics. "Where are we going?" I panted. "The road," Sarah said. "If we can reach the highway—" But even as she said it, I knew we were hopelessly lost. In our panic, we'd run without paying attention to direction or landmarks. The trail could be leading us deeper into the wilderness, farther from any hope of rescue. Sarah's flare began to sputter, its brilliant light fading to orange, then red, then darkness. We stumbled to a halt in a small clearing, our harsh breathing the only sound in the sudden silence. "Do you have another flare?" Jake whispered. "Two more," Sarah said. "But if I light one now, it'll give away our position." We stood in the darkness, straining to hear any sign of the thing that had been hunting us. The forest around us was alive with small sounds, the rustle of wind through leaves, the distant call of an owl, the scurry of some nocturnal creature through undergrowth, normal sounds that should have been comforting but instead made every shadow a potential threat. "What was that thing?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Some kind of parasite, maybe. Something that can take over a host body." "But it knew things," I said. "Things only Tyler would know." "Memories might transfer with the brain tissue," Sarah said with clinical detachment. "Or maybe it can access the host's stored information somehow." The conversation felt surreal, discussing the biological mechanics of supernatural horror while hiding in a forest clearing at 3 a.m. But talking helped combat the panic that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. "So Tyler's dead?" Jake asked. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. The host body might still be alive, just controlled by something else. We have to help him." "Jake, no. Whatever that thing is, it's not Tyler anymore, and it's hunting us." A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our clearing. We froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, the deliberate footfall of something moving through the forest with purpose. "Tyler?" The voice drifted through the trees, perfectly mimicking our friend's tone. "Guys, where are you? I'm scared." Jake started to answer, but Sarah clamped her hand over his mouth. "Please," the Tyler voice continued. "I don't know what happened to me. Everything's confused. I think I'm hurt." It was a perfect performance. complete with the slight tremor Tyler's voice got when he was genuinely frightened. If I hadn't seen the thing's true face in the flare light, I might have believed it. The voice was moving around the perimeter of our clearing, testing different approaches. I found something out there, something that's been waiting in these woods for a long time. It showed me things, terrible things, but I got away. I need help. Tears were streaming down Jake's face, caught between the desperate hope that his friend was still alive and the growing certainty that we were being hunted by something wearing Tyler's corpse. "I know you're here," the voice said, and now it was coming from directly behind us. "I can smell your fear." Sarah ignited her second flare. The thing stood 10 feet away, no longer bothering to maintain human posture. It crouched on all fours like an animal, Tyler's limbs bent at impossible angles. Its face, Tyler's face, was split open from ear to ear, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that definitely didn't belong to any human mouth. But the worst part was Tyler's eyes, still recognizably his own, staring out from that corrupted face with desperate terror. Whatever was controlling his body, some part of the real Tyler was still trapped inside, aware of what was happening but powerless to stop it. The thing lunged at us with inhuman speed. Jake threw himself sideways, bowling into me and sending us both crashing into the undergrowth. Sarah rolled in the opposite direction, still clutching the flare like a weapon. The Tyler thing landed where we'd been standing, its claws, Tyler's fingernails grown long and sharp, gouging furrows in the earth. It spun toward Jake and me with fluid grace, no longer pretending to be human. "Jake, run!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet, but Jake was staring at the thing's face, at Tyler's trapped eyes. "Tyler, fight it! I know you're in there!" The thing paused, its head tilting with predatory curiosity. When it spoke, two voices came out, the inhuman thing and Tyler himself, speaking in horrible harmony. "Help me," they said together. "Kill me." Jake took a step toward it, and I knew he was going to try something heroic and stupid. The Jake I'd known in college had always been the type to run toward trouble rather than away from it. It was going to get him killed. I tackled him from behind, sending us both tumbling down a steep slope covered in loose rocks and pine needles. Above us, the Tyler thing shrieked in frustration, a sound like metal scraping against bone. We hit the bottom of the slope hard, Jake crying out as his shoulder struck a fallen log. But we were alive, and we were moving. I hauled him to his feet, ignoring his protests. "We have to go back," he said. "We have to help him." "We can't help him, Jake. He's gone." "You don't know that." "Look at me," I said, grabbing his shoulders. "That thing is using Tyler to hunt us. Every second we waste here is another chance for it to kill us all." Sarah slid down the slope behind us, still clutching her flare. "It's coming," she said. "We need to move." We ran again, following what looked like a dry stream bed deeper into the forest. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it in the fall, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind us, the Tyler thing crashed through the undergrowth in pursuit, no longer bothering with stealth. The stream bed led to a rocky canyon where the walls rose 20 feet on either side. It felt like a trap, but we had no choice. The thing was too close behind us to risk trying to climb out. "There," Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. The canyon narrowed to a gap barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond it, I could see moonlight reflecting off water, a lake or large stream. If we could reach it, we squeezed through the gap one at a time, the rock walls so close they scraped our shoulders. Behind us, the Tyler thing howled with frustration, unable to follow in its current form. But as we emerged on the other side, I realized our mistake. We weren't looking at a lake. We were standing on a ledge overlooking a deep pool fed by a waterfall. The sound of falling water had masked the thing's approach through another route. "Dead end," Jake said. The Tyler thing emerged from the trees behind us, moving on two legs again but with joints that bent in ways human anatomy couldn't accommodate. In the moonlight, I could see that Tyler's clothes were hanging in tatters and his skin had taken on a mottled, fungal appearance. "Nowhere to run now," it said in Tyler's voice. We backed toward the edge of the ledge. The drop was maybe 30 feet to the water below. Survivable if we hit the pool, fatal if we struck the rocks. "On 3, Sarah whispered. We jumped together. "Are you insane?" Jake hissed. "It's our only chance." The Tyler thing was advancing slowly now, savoring our terror. It had shed the last pretense of humanity, moving with fluid grace that belonged to no earthly predator. Tyler's face was still recognizable, but his eyes had gone completely black, reflecting no light at all. "1," Sarah whispered. The thing lunged forward with impossible speed. 2. Jake grabbed my hand, his grip slick with sweat. 3. We jumped. The fall seemed to last forever, wind rushing past my ears and my stomach dropping into my throat. Then cold water closed over my head, driving the breath from my lungs with its icy embrace. I surfaced, gasping, the shock of the water clearing my head for the first time in hours. Sarah and Jake were beside me, both alive and relatively unharmed. Above us, the Tyler thing stood on the ledge, staring down with those black, empty eyes. "It can't follow us here," Sarah said, treading water. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want to get wet." We swam to the far shore, hauling ourselves onto a rocky beach. My clothes clung to my body, already freezing in the mountain air. But we were alive, and we'd put a barrier between ourselves and the thing. "Now what?" Jake asked through chattering teeth. "We keep moving," Sarah said. "Find the trail, get back to the road." But even as she said it, I could see doubt in her eyes. We were lost, soaked and freezing. Dawn was still hours away, and we had no idea which direction led to safety. The Tyler thing called to us from across the water, its voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You can't run forever. I know these woods. I know every trail, every hiding place, and I'm not the only one here." It was lying, I told myself, trying to break our will to fight. "There are others," it continued, "other hikers who stayed too long, who wandered too far from the trails. They're all here now, all part of the forest. Would you like to meet them?" From the darkness around the pool, other voices began to call. A woman's voice, crying for help. A child's voice, singing a nursery rhyme. An old man's voice, reciting GPS coordinates in a monotone. But underneath the human voices, I could hear something else. A sound like wind through dry leaves, or perhaps like thousands of insects moving through dead grass. It was the sound of the forest itself, awakening to our presence. "We need to move," I said. "Now." We followed the shoreline, looking for a way out of the canyon. The voices followed us, always just out of sight in the darkness. Sometimes I caught glimpses of figures moving between the trees, people in hiking clothes, their faces pale in the moonlight. But when I looked directly at them, they disappeared like smoke. "Are you seeing this?" Jake whispered. "Try not to look at them," Sarah advised. "Focus on finding a way out." The shoreline led to a scramble-up loose rock that brought us to another ridge. From here I could see lights in the distance, the glow of a town or highway, civilization, safety, the promise of hot coffee and warm beds and people who would believe our story. "There," I said, pointing. "Maybe 5 miles." It felt like 100 miles. We were exhausted, hypothermic, and lost in country that seemed actively hostile to human presence. But it was hope, and hope was enough to keep us moving. We picked our way down the far side of the ridge, using Sarah's remaining flare sparingly to navigate the worst obstacles. The voices had faded, but I could still feel something watching us from the darkness. The forest felt patient now, as if it knew we were weakening and could afford to wait. "Jake," Sarah said suddenly. "Jake, stop." We turned to look at her. She was standing motionless on the trail, staring at something ahead of us. "What is it?" I asked. "Look at Jake's shadow." I looked. Jake stood clearly outlined in the fading light of Sarah's flare, casting a normal shadow on the ground behind him. But, as I watched, a second shadow detached itself from the first, a darker silhouette that moved independently, reaching toward Sarah with fingers that were too long and too sharp. "Oh, God," Jake whispered, looking down at his own shadow. "Oh, God, it's in me." He convulsed suddenly, his body jerking like a marionette with tangled strings. When he straightened, his eyes had gone flat and black, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp. "Hello, Sarah," he said in a voice that was Jake's but wrong. "Hello, Mike." Sarah raised her flare like a weapon, but the Jake thing was faster. It struck the device from her hand, sending it spinning into the darkness where it hissed and died against wet stones. Absolute darkness fell over us like a burial shroud. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the Jake thing moving in the darkness, circling us with predatory patience. Its breathing had changed, becoming wet and labored, as if its lungs were filling with fluid. "Jake, fight it," I said desperately. "You're stronger than this thing." "Jake's not here anymore," the thing said. "He invited me in, made it so easy." "You're lying." "Am I? Think about it, Mike. Jake's always been weak, always needed to be the hero, needed everyone to like him. When I showed him what I could offer, power, fearlessness, the ability to protect his friends, he practically begged me to take him." I wanted to argue, but something about the words rang true. Jake had always been insecure beneath his confident exterior, always pushing himself to dangerous extremes to prove his worth. "Where's Sarah?" I asked. "Oh, she's here, hiding in the rocks like a frightened animal. But don't worry, I'll find her soon enough." The Jake thing was close now. I could smell the same organic sweetness that had marked the Tyler thing, the stench of corruption and decay, but underneath it was something else. The familiar scent of Jake's deodorant, his shampoo, the cigarettes he sneaked when he thought no one was looking. "You want to know the funny thing?" the Jake thing whispered, its voice right beside my ear. "Part of him is still in here, still conscious. He can see everything I'm doing, feel everything I'm feeling. And he knows there's nothing he can do to stop me." Cold fingers touched my throat. Jake's fingers, but wrong. The nails had grown long and sharp, and the skin felt clammy and dead. "He's screaming right now," the thing continued, "screaming for me to stop, begging me not to hurt his best friend. But his voice is getting fainter. Soon it'll be gone completely, and I'll have this body all to myself." "Jake," I said, addressing my friend directly, "I know you can hear me. You're not weak. You never were. Fight this thing." The fingers around my throat tightened, cutting off my air, but for just a moment I felt them tremble. "Jake," I gasped. The grip loosened slightly. In the darkness I heard Jake's voice, not the thing wearing his body, but Jake himself. "Mike, run." Then something struck the Jake thing from behind, sending it sprawling. Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. "This way." I stumbled after her, guided by the sound of her movement. Behind us, the Jake thing roared with frustration and rage, but it sounded less coordinated now, as if Jake was fighting for control of his own body. "Here," Sarah whispered, grabbing my hand. She pulled me into a narrow crevice between two large boulders. It was a tight fit, barely wide enough for our bodies, but it offered concealment. We squeezed as far back as we could, pressing ourselves against the cold stone. The Jake thing thrashed around outside, searching for us. I could hear it talking to itself. Or rather, I could hear two voices arguing. Jake and the thing that had invaded him fighting for dominance. "Let me find them," the creature snarled. "No," Jake replied, his voice strained but determined. "I won't let you hurt them. You can't stop me forever. I'm stronger than you." "Maybe, but I know these rocks. Played here as a kid when my family came camping. I know every hiding place, every escape route, and I'm not telling you anything." The sound of their internal struggle was horrible. Jake fighting against his own body, trying to sabotage the creature's efforts to track us. I heard him stumble and fall, heard him deliberately strike his head against a tree trunk. "Stop it," the creature howled. "Make me," Jake replied. The sounds grew fainter as the Jake thing staggered away, still fighting with itself. Sarah and I remained hidden in our rocky shelter, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. "Is he gone?" I whispered. "I don't know. Give it a few more minutes." We waited in tense silence, listening to the normal sounds of the forest. Gradually, it became clear that the Jake thing had moved on, either driven away by its internal struggle or following a false trail. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said. "Get to those lights." We squeezed out of our hiding place and resumed our trek toward civilization. Without the flare, navigation was treacherous, but the lights in the distance provided a fixed reference point. We moved slowly, testing each step, afraid that any noise might bring the corrupted versions of our friends down on us. "Sarah," I said as we picked our way across a rocky slope, "what happened back there? How did you get away from it?" "I hit it with a rock," she said. "As soon as it grabbed you, I just reacted. Medical training, I guess. When someone's in danger, you act." "But how did you know where to find me?" She hesitated. "I could hear Jake. The real Jake, I mean. He was trying to help you, even while that thing was using his body. He kept whispering directions. 30 feet ahead, behind the big boulder. He was fighting it the whole time." The thought of Jake trapped inside his own body, watching helplessly as something else controlled his actions, was almost too horrible to contemplate. But it also gave me hope. If Jake could resist the creature's control, even temporarily, maybe there was still a way to save him. "We have to go back," I said. "Mike, no. We've been through this. Jake saved us. He's still fighting that thing. We can't just abandon him." "What exactly are you proposing? We don't have weapons, we don't know what we're dealing with, and we're barely staying ahead of them as it is." She was right, of course, but the thought of leaving Jake to whatever fate awaited him made my stomach twist with guilt. "Then we get help," I said. "Real help. We reach those lights, call in the cavalry." "And tell them what? That our friends have been possessed by evil forest spirits? They'll think we're having a psychotic break." "Then we lie. We say they're injured, or trapped, or being held by hostile locals. Whatever it takes to get search and rescue out here." We reached the bottom of the slope and found ourselves on what looked like an old logging road. 2 parallel ruts carved through the forest, overgrown with grass and small shrubs. It was easier going than the rocky terrain we'd been navigating, and it seemed to lead in the direction of the lights. "This is good," Sarah said. "Road means people, civilization." We followed the road for what felt like hours, though the darkness made it difficult to judge time. The lights ahead grew gradually brighter, resolving into the distinct glow of streetlights and building signs. A town, small but unmistakably real. As we walked, I found myself thinking about the stories Tyler had told around the campfire. The missing family. The little girl who insisted her real family was still in the woods. How many others had encountered the things that lived in the Three Sisters wilderness? How many had escaped to tell stories that no one believed? "Sarah," I said, "what do you think those things are? Really?" She was quiet for a long time before answering. "I've been thinking about that. The way they can take over host bodies, access memories. It reminds me of certain parasites. Toxoplasma gondii, for instance. It can alter host behavior, make mice unafraid of cats. But this is something far more sophisticated. You think they're parasites? Maybe, or maybe something else entirely. There are fungi that can control insect behavior, turn them into zombies. And there are theories about viral organisms that might affect human consciousness in ways we don't understand. But Tyler's body, it changed, became something that wasn't human. Perhaps the organism needs to modify the host to suit its needs, like a hermit crab changing shells. The scientific discussion helped keep my mind off the immediate horror of our situation, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality. Our friends had been taken by something that wore their faces while using their bodies for its own purposes. The lights ahead resolved into a small town, maybe 50 buildings clustered around a main street. A sign at the town limits read, "Welcome to Sisters, Oregon. Population 2038. Below that, someone had spray-painted, "Elevation 3,180 feet. You are here." Sisters. I'd heard of the place, a tourist town that served as a gateway to the wilderness areas. It would have a sheriff's station, maybe even a Forest Service outpost, people who would know how to organize a search and rescue operation. But as we walked down the empty main street, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every building was dark. Every streetlight was off. No cars moved on the roads, and no lights showed in any windows. "Where is everyone?" Sarah whispered. "Maybe it's later than we thought. Small towns shut down early." But even as I said it, I could see it wasn't true. This wasn't a town that had gone to sleep. This was a town that had been abandoned. Storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and dusty. A gas station's pumps stood silent, their digital displays blank. Even the streetlights were dead, leaving us in darkness broken only by the moon overhead. "This is wrong," Sarah said. "This is all wrong." She was right. The lights we'd been following had led us to a ghost town, a place that might have been bustling with life during the day but was now as empty as a stage set. The silence was complete. No traffic, no air conditioners, no distant television broadcasts. Just the whisper of wind through empty streets. "We should find a phone," I said. "See if any of the buildings are unlocked." We tried the gas station first, pushing on the glass doors until we discovered they weren't locked. They were simply stuck, as if no one had opened them in months. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. The cash register sat open and empty, and the shelves were bare except for a few scattered items covered in dust. "How long has this place been empty?" Sarah wondered aloud. I found a payphone near the restrooms, an ancient device that probably hadn't been used in years. I lifted the receiver and listened for a dial tone, but heard only dead silence. "Nothing," I reported. We tried several other buildings with the same result. The town of Sisters had become a shell, empty of human life but showing no signs of violence or disaster. It was as if everyone had simply decided to leave one day, taking nothing with them. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said. "Find the highway." But as we turned to leave the gas station, I saw something that made me freeze in the doorway. Two figures were walking down the main street toward us, familiar silhouettes moving with the careful gait of people navigating rough terrain. Tyler and Jake. Or the things wearing their bodies. "They found us," I whispered. Sarah pushed past me to look, then ducked back into the shadows. "How is that possible? We've been walking for hours. Maybe they know shortcuts. Or maybe they don't get tired like we do." The Tyler thing and Jake thing stopped in the middle of the street, just out of the range of clear vision. They seemed to be having a conversation, two predators discussing strategy. "Mike," the Tyler thing called. "Sarah, we know you're here." Its voice echoed off the empty buildings, taking on an unnatural quality that made it seem to come from all directions at once. "We're not angry," the Jake thing added. "We just want to talk." "Like hell," Sarah muttered. "We understand you're scared," Tyler thing continued. "But you don't need to be. We can offer you things you've never imagined. Freedom from fear, from doubt, from all the little anxieties that plague human existence. No pain," Jake thing said. "No uncertainty, just purpose. Pure, clean purpose. And all we ask in return is that you let us in. Just open your minds. Let us show you what we can offer." The words were almost hypnotic, delivered in the familiar voices of our friends. For a moment I found myself actually considering the offer. Life without anxiety, without the constant worry that had plagued me since childhood. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip sharp enough to break the spell. "Don't listen to them," she hissed. "That's how they get in. Through invitation." The things in the street had started moving again, checking each building systematically. It would only be a matter of time before they reached the gas station. "Back door," I whispered. We crept through the store's back room, past shelves of dusty motor oil and antifreeze, to a rear exit that opened onto an alley. The door was unlocked, like everything else in this dead town. The alley was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for a delivery truck. It ran behind the main street buildings parallel to the road we'd entered on. If we could reach the far end without being spotted, "This way," Sarah whispered, pointing toward what looked like open country beyond the town limits. We moved carefully, staying in the shadows cast by overhanging roof lines. Behind us, I could hear the Tyler thing and Jake thing calling our names, their voices taking on an increasingly frustrated edge. "We're trying to help you," Tyler thing said, "but our patience isn't infinite." "The other things in the forest aren't as generous as we are," Jake thing added. "If they find you first—" The threat hung in the air, unfinished but clear. Whatever else was waiting in the wilderness, it would be worse than what our friends had become. We reached the end of the alley and found ourselves at the edge of town, where buildings gave way to open ground covered in scrub brush and scattered rocks. Beyond that, the forest began again, dark and impenetrable in the moonlight. "Now what?" I asked. Sarah pointed to a line of power poles that marched across the landscape, carrying electrical cables toward a distant glow on the horizon. "Follow the power lines. They'll lead to another town, or at least a highway." It was a good plan. Power lines always led somewhere, and the cleared ground beneath them would be easier to navigate than forest trails. We started walking, keeping the poles in sight while staying far enough away to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Behind us, the dead town of Sisters slowly receded into darkness. But I could still hear the things calling our names, their voices growing fainter but no less menacing. We walked for what felt like hours, following the power lines across rolling hills covered in sagebrush and scattered pines. The landscape was more open here, offering fewer hiding places but better visibility. If anything was following us, we'd see it coming. "How much farther?" I asked as we crested another hill. Hard to say. These lines could run for miles before hitting another grid junction. But even as she spoke, I could see lights ahead, the orange glow of sodium streetlights and the scattered white dots of building illumination. Another town, and this one looked very much alive. "Thank God," Sarah breathed. The town was bigger than Sisters, maybe 1,000 people with a main drag lined with motels and fast food restaurants. Signs identified it as Bend, Oregon, and even at 3 in the morning there was some activity. A few cars on the roads, lights in several buildings, the warm glow of a 24-hour diner. We practically ran the last quarter mile, driven by the promise of safety and human contact. The diner sat on the outskirts of town, a classic chrome and neon establishment that looked like it had been transplanted from the 1950s. Through the windows, I could see a waitress refilling coffee for a couple of late-night customers. Normal people. Real people. The sight of them made me want to cry with relief. We pushed through the front door, setting off a cheerful bell that announced our arrival. The waitress looked up from her coffee pot with professional hospitality that immediately shifted to concern when she saw our condition. "My God, what happened to you folks?" We must have looked like hell. Soaked, scratched, exhausted, and probably in the early stages of hypothermia. Sarah took charge, falling back on her medical training to present a coherent story. "We need to call 911, she said. "We were camping in the Three Sisters wilderness. 2 of our friends are missing." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, immediately reached for the phone behind the counter. "Of course, honey. Let me get you some coffee while we wait for the sheriff." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, coffee, and the surreal experience of trying to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. The sheriff who responded to the call was a competent-looking man in his 50s who took detailed notes and asked probing questions about our friend's last known location. "We'll get search and rescue out at first light," he promised. "Weather's supposed to be clear, so we'll have aircraft support. If your friends are out there, we'll find them." Sarah and I exchanged glances. We both knew that whatever search and rescue found, it wouldn't be our friends, not anymore. But we couldn't explain that without sounding delusional. "Is there somewhere we can stay?" I asked. "We don't have our wallets." "Don't worry about that," the sheriff said. "Martha here knows everyone in town. She'll find you a place." Martha, the waitress, nodded emphatically. "My sister runs the motel next door. She'll put you up, no questions asked." An hour later, I was sitting on the edge of a motel bed, staring at the television without really seeing it. Sarah had collapsed in the room's single chair, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake her. The sheriff had promised to call us with any news from the search operation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. The things that had taken Tyler and Jake might be trapped in the wilderness for now, but what about the next hikers who wandered too far from the trails? What about the searchers who would go looking for our friends? And what about the empty town of Sisters? Had its entire population been taken by the same force, or had they simply fled when they realized what was living in their backyard? "Mike," Sarah said softly, "try to get some sleep. We'll need our strength tomorrow." "For what?" "For whatever comes next." I wanted to argue that it was over, that we'd escaped and could put the whole nightmare behind us. But deep down, I knew she was right. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Somewhere in the Three Sisters wilderness, things that wore our friends' faces were waiting for the next group of hikers to wander into their territory. And somewhere in an empty town called Sisters, other things were probably discussing new strategies for expanding their hunting grounds. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I heard Tyler's voice calling my name from the darkness outside the motel window. When I looked, there was never anyone there, just empty parking lot and distant mountains silhouetted against the stars. But I knew they were out there, waiting for us to let our guard down. And I knew that sooner or later we'd have to go back. The real Tyler and Jake were still alive, trapped inside their own bodies while something else pulled the strings. As long as there was even a chance of saving them, I couldn't just walk away. Sarah was right. This was just the beginning. And when morning came, we'd have to decide whether to tell the truth about what we'd seen, or let the searchers walk into the same trap that had claimed our friends. Either way, the things in the forest would be waiting. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Salmon Huckleberry Wilderness, about 40 miles southeast of Portland, Oregon, during the third week of September 2024. I should have known something was wrong when my GPS started glitching on Highway 26, but Jessica was driving and chattering about her new promotion, and Mike was passed out in the back seat with his mouth hanging open like a dead fish. The three of us had been planning this backpacking trip for months. 3 days, 2 nights in some of Oregon's most pristine wilderness. A chance to disconnect, Jess had said, to find ourselves again. I wish we'd stayed lost. The thing about the Salmon Huckleberry Wilderness is that it's genuinely remote. No cell towers, no ranger stations, no convenient escape routes back to civilization. Just 44 to 560 acres of old-growth forest, alpine meadows, and enough elevation changes to make your lungs burn. The trail we'd chosen, a lesser-known loop that would take us past Shellrock Lake and up toward the ridgeline, promised solitude. What it delivered was something else entirely. We started hiking around noon, after Mike finally dragged himself out of the car and downed 2 cups of gas station coffee. He'd been going through a rough patch since his divorce finalized in August, drinking too much and sleeping too little. Jess and I had hoped the wilderness would do him some good, help him reset. Looking back, I think the wilderness sensed his vulnerability the moment we stepped onto the trail. The first few miles were everything we'd hoped for. Towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks created a cathedral canopy above us, filtering the September sunlight into soft, dappled patterns on the trail. The air smelled of moss and decomposing leaves, that rich, earthy scent that makes you feel like you're breathing in the forest's very soul. Mike's spirits seemed to lift as we walked. He started making his terrible puns again, pointing out formidable trees and pining for lunch. "Jesus, Mike," Jess laughed, readjusting her pack straps. "I'd forgotten how bad your jokes were." "That's Dr. Terrible Jokes to you," he shot back. And for a moment, it felt like old times. Like we were just 3 friends from college again, before life got complicated with careers and relationships, and all the weight that comes with being an adult. We made good time to our first campsite, a clearing about 6 miles in where Shell Rock Creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The sound of moving water has always been soothing to me, but as we set up camp that first afternoon, I noticed something odd. The creek's sound seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention, sometimes gurgling like normal water, sometimes almost like whispers, like voices having a conversation just below the threshold of understanding. "You hear that?" I asked Jess as she unpacked her sleeping bag. "Hear what?" I listened again, but now it just sounded like water. "Nothing. Never mind." Mike had wandered off to gather firewood, and when he returned, his arms full of dry branches, his mood had shifted. The easy humor was gone, replaced by something distant and hollow. "Weird trees around here," he said, dropping the wood in a pile. "Some of them have these marks, like claw marks, but way too high up for any animal." Jess looked up from her camp stove. "Probably just bark beetles or something. Environmental damage." But I saw Mike's face, and whatever he'd seen out there, he didn't think it was beetles. We got our fire going just as the sun began to set behind the ridgeline. This far into the wilderness, darkness comes fast and complete. No light pollution, no distant street lamps, just the kind of absolute blackness that makes you understand why our ancestors feared the night. I've always been uncomfortable in complete darkness, a leftover from childhood terrors that never quite went away. But here, surrounded by thousands of acres of forest, that childhood fear felt suddenly rational. "Fire's burning weird," Mike said, poking at the flames with a stick. He was right. Despite using dry wood and good kindling, the flames kept shifting from normal orange to an unsettling blue-green color. I'd never seen anything like it. "Could be minerals in the wood," Jess suggested, but she sounded uncertain. We cooked dinner, dehydrated pasta that tasted like cardboard, and tried to maintain normal conversation, but something had settled over our little campsite. A weight in the air, like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. The darkness beyond our fire's circle felt dense and watchful. I found myself straining to hear sounds that might indicate we weren't alone, but the forest had gone completely silent. No owl hoots, no rustling of small animals, not even the buzz of insects. "This is too quiet," I said. Mike looked up from his meal. "What do you mean?" "Listen. Really listen. Where are all the sounds? We're in the middle of a forest. There should be night sounds." We sat in silence for a full minute. The only sound was the creak and the occasional pop from our strange burning fire. "Maybe we scared them off," Jess said, but her voice had gotten smaller. I was about to respond when we heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl and my primitive brain scream warnings. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, then rose to a wailing cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something in between, or perhaps something that had once been human but wasn't anymore. "What the fuck was that?" Mike whispered. The sound came again, closer this time and definitely from the direction of the creek. In the firelight I could see the water, maybe 30 feet away, but beyond that was just impenetrable darkness. "Probably just a cougar," Jess said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "They can make some pretty weird sounds." We sat in tense silence for another 10 minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, exhaustion and the day's hiking caught up with us, and we decided to turn in. I was the last one awake, staring up at the slice of stars visible through the canopy, when I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. I held my breath and listened. The steps were too heavy to be an animal, too purposeful to be random. They made a complete circuit around our camp, staying just at the edge of what our dying fire could illuminate. I wanted to wake Jess and Mike, but some primal instinct told me to lie still, to pretend to be asleep. The footsteps stopped directly across from my sleeping bag on the other side of the fire. I could feel something watching me, studying me. The weight of that attention was like a physical pressure on my chest. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, every muscle in my body coiled tight with terror. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the presence moved away. The footsteps resumed, growing fainter as whatever it was retreated into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked the area where I'd heard the footsteps. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding tracks, but there were none. Not human prints, not animal tracks, nothing. As if whatever had circled our camp left no more impression on the world than a shadow. I decided not to tell Jess and Mike about the nighttime visitor. Mike was already on edge, and Jess would just rationalize it away. Besides, maybe I had imagined it. Sleep deprivation can do strange things to your mind. We broke camp and continued deeper into the wilderness. Our second day's hike would take us up toward the ridgeline, climbing about 2,000 feet in elevation over 8 miles. It was going to be a challenging day, but the views from the top would be worth it. Or so we thought. The trail grew steeper and more difficult as the morning progressed. Mike, who was usually the strongest hiker among us, began falling behind. At first, I attributed it to his recent drinking and lack of exercise, but by midday, it was clear something else was wrong. His face had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes seemed unfocused, as if he was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. "You okay, Mike?" Jess asked during one of our water breaks. "Yeah, fine," he said, but his voice sounded different. Flatter, like all the emotion had been drained out of it. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. "There's no shame in cutting the trip short." Mike's head snapped toward me, and for just a moment his eyes seemed to focus with unnatural intensity. "No. We go up. We have to go up." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl, but Jess was already shouldering her pack. "He's right," she said. "We've come this far. Besides, the weather's supposed to turn tomorrow. This might be our only chance to see the view." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't articulate why every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and hike back to the car as fast as possible. So I followed them up the increasingly treacherous trail. That's when our technology began to fail in earnest. My GPS unit, which had been glitchy since the drive-up, now showed our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Jess's phone compass spun wildly, never settling on a consistent direction. Mike's backup GPS was completely dead, despite showing a full battery charge that morning. "Must be some kind of magnetic anomaly," Jess said, consulting her paper map. "Good thing we brought backup navigation." But even the paper map seemed wrong. The trail we were following wasn't marked on it, and the landmarks didn't match what we were seeing. According to the map, we should have been able to see Mount Hood to the northeast, but the mountain was nowhere in sight. "This doesn't make sense," I said, studying the topographical lines. "We should be here." I pointed to a spot on the map. "But if we're here, then where the hell is the mountain?" Mike laughed, a sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Maybe the mountain moved. As afternoon faded toward evening, we found ourselves in a small clearing surrounded by enormous old-growth trees. The space felt wrong somehow. Too perfectly circular, too conveniently sized for a campsite. But we were exhausted, and the light was failing, and we had little choice. "This'll have to do," Jess said, shrugging off her pack. As we set up camp for the second night, I noticed more strangeness. Our food, which had been fine that morning, now smelled off. Not spoiled exactly, but wrong, like it was rotting from the inside out. Mike's sleeping bag, which he'd packed carefully that morning, was unzipped and turned inside out when he pulled it from his pack. "That's weird," he said, examining it. "I know I rolled this up tight, but the worst thing was the trees." In the fading daylight, I could see what Mike had been talking about the day before. Deep gouges in the bark, running vertically up the massive trunks. Too high for bears, too wide for cougars. Some of the marks were old, healed over with scar tissue, but others looked fresh. Recent, like something very large and very angry had been sharpening its claws. We got another fire going, though again it burned with that unsettling blue-green flame. The strange color cast everything in an otherworldly light, making our faces look corpse-like, and the surrounding trees seemed to writhe and twist. "I don't like this place," I said. Mike looked at me across the fire, and in that eerie light, his face looked different. Younger somehow, but also ancient, like something old was looking out through his eyes. "The place doesn't like you either," he said quietly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jess asked. Mike blinked and his expression returned to normal. "Sorry, I don't know why I said that. I'm just tired." We ate our questionable dinner in relative silence. The forest around us remained unnaturally quiet, as if every living thing for miles had simply vanished. The only sounds were our own voices and the crackling of the fire. That's when we started losing time. One moment we were sitting around the fire, discussing our route for the next day. The next moment I was startling awake in my sleeping bag, with no memory of lying down. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers, and according to my watch, 4 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. "Jess," I whispered. "Jess, wake up." She stirred in her sleeping bag. "What? What time is it?" "Past midnight. Do you remember going to sleep?" She was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking. "No," she said finally. "I remember we were talking about—" "What were we talking about?" I tried to remember, but the memory slipped away like water through my fingers. We'd been discussing something important, something that had made me anxious, but I couldn't grasp what it was. "Where's Mike?" Jess asked. I looked around our small camp. Mike's sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside. His boots were gone. "Mike," I called softly. No answer. "Mike," Jess called louder. Nothing but the sound of our dying fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. We spent the rest of the night awake, feeding the fire and calling Mike's name periodically. As dawn broke gray and cold through the canopy, we made the decision to pack up and look for him. Maybe he'd just gone to relieve himself and gotten turned around in the dark. People got lost in the woods all the time, especially at night. But even as I told myself this, I knew it wasn't true. Mike was an experienced hiker. He wouldn't wander off in the dark without a flashlight, without telling us where he was going. We spent the morning in expanding search patterns around our campsite, calling his name and looking for any sign of his passage. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and moss, making it nearly impossible to track, but we found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded gear. It was as if Mike had simply evaporated. "We need to go for help," I said as we regrouped at our campsite around noon. Jess nodded. "I'll go back down the trail, try to find a ranger station or at least get cell service. You stay here in case he comes back." "No," I said quickly. "We stay together. Something's wrong here, Jess. Really wrong. We both go or we both stay." She looked at me strangely. "Sarah, you're starting to freak me out. Mike probably just got disoriented. It happens." "Does it?" I pointed to our campsite. "Look around. Really look. Have you seen a single bird since we got here? A single insect? Heard any animal sounds at all?" Jess was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the forest around us. "Animals avoid areas with predators," she said finally. "What kind of predator clears out an entire forest ecosystem?" Before she could answer, we heard Mike calling from somewhere in the trees. "Sarah, Jess, where are you?" Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a chill of unease. Something about his voice sounded off. The tone was right. The words were right. But there was something else. Something that made my lizard brain want to run. "Mike," Jess called back, "we're at the campsite." He emerged from the tree line a few minutes later, and at first glance, he looked fine. Same clothes, same gear, same familiar face. But as he got closer, the wrongness became more apparent. He wasn't blinking at all. His eyes were wide and staring, like someone in a trance. His clothes were clean. After a night lost in the forest, they should have been dirty, torn, stained with mud and sap. Instead, they looked like he'd just put them on. His smile was too wide, stretching his mouth in a way that looked painful. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "Got turned around in the dark. You know how it is." "Where have you been?" Jess asked. "We've been looking for you all morning." "Around," Mike said, still smiling that terrible smile. "Just around and about, exploring, learning." "Learning what?" I asked. He turned to look at me and I had to suppress a shudder. His eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from corner to corner, was the color of deep water at night. "Learning about you," he said. Jess didn't seem to notice anything wrong. She was already moving toward her pack, relief evident in her body language. "Well, thank God you're okay," she said. Sarah was starting to think something supernatural was going on. Mike's smile somehow got even wider. "Supernatural? What a funny idea." I backed away slowly, my hand moving toward my hiking knife. "Jess," I said quietly, "that's not Mike." She turned to look at me like I'd lost my mind. "What are you talking about? Of course it's Mike." "Look at his eyes, Jess. Look at his fucking eyes." She looked and I saw her face change as she finally noticed what I was seeing. The too wide smile, the unblinking stare, the wrongness that radiated from him like heat from a fever. "Mike," she said uncertainly, Are you feeling okay?" "Never better," he said, taking a step toward her. "Never more myself than I am right now." That's when I saw what was in his hand. My hiking knife, the one I'd been reaching for. Somehow, impossibly, he'd taken it from my belt without me feeling it. "Run," I whispered to Jess. Mike's head swiveled toward me with predatory precision. "Running would be rude. We haven't finished getting acquainted." I grabbed Jess's arm and yanked her toward the trail. "Run!" We crashed through the undergrowth, abandoning our gear and any pretense of following marked trails. Behind us, I could hear Mike laughing, a sound like breaking glass and grinding teeth. "You can't run from what's inside," he called after us. "You can't run from what you've already let in." We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a fallen log to catch our breath. The forest around us was still unnaturally quiet, but at least we couldn't hear Mike's laughter anymore. "What the hell was that?" Jess gasped. "I don't know," I said, "but it wasn't Mike. Not anymore." "That's impossible. People don't just change like that." "Look around, Jess. Nothing about this place is possible. The silence, the missing animals, the way our technology keeps failing. Something's wrong with this entire area." As if summoned by my words, we heard Mike's voice echoing through the trees. But now it was coming from multiple directions at once, as if there were several of him scattered through the forest. "Sarah? Jess, don't you want to see what I've learned?" The voice came from our left, then our right, then from directly behind us. "I've learned so much about hunger, about need, about what it means to be truly empty." We started moving again, trying to put distance between ourselves and the voices. But no matter which direction we went, Mike's voice followed us. Sometimes it sounded like it was right next to us, whispering in our ears. Sometimes it echoed from the canopy above, as if he was somehow moving through the treetops. "The trees remember everything," his voice said from somewhere in the branches. "Every person who's walked through here, every fear, every secret, every moment of desperation. They remember, and they're hungry for more." We found ourselves in another clearing, this one smaller and more claustrophobic than our campsite. The trees here seemed to lean inward, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural cage. "We're going in circles," Jess said, panic creeping into her voice. She was right. Despite our best efforts to maintain a straight line away from our campsite, we'd somehow ended up in what looked like the same type of clearing where we'd spent the previous night. "This isn't possible," I said. "We've been walking downhill. We should be able to find the main trail." "Sarah." Jess's voice was barely a whisper. "Look." She was pointing at the trees surrounding us. Carved into the bark about 6 feet off the ground were symbols, not random scratches or natural patterns, but deliberate markings. They looked old, weathered by years of exposure, but they were clearly intentional. And they were moving. As I watched, the carved lines shifted and writhed like living things. The symbols seemed to rearrange themselves, forming new patterns, new meanings. Looking at them too long made my eyes water and my head spin. "Don't look directly at them," I said, pulling Jess away. "Something's not right about those markings." But it was too late. Jess was staring at the symbols with glassy-eyed fascination, her mouth slightly open. "They're beautiful," she said in a dreamy voice. "They're trying to tell us something." "Jess, stop looking at them." "They're saying—" She tilted her head, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "They're saying we belong here, that we've always belonged here." I grabbed her shoulders and shook her. "Jess, snap out of it." She blinked and focused on me, confusion replacing the dreamy expression. What just happened?" "We need to get out of here, now." But even as I said it, I knew it was too late. The forest around us had begun to change. The trees were definitely leaning inward now, their branches extending toward us like grasping fingers. The clearing was getting smaller, the circle of open space contracting with each passing moment. And somewhere in the growing darkness between the trees, I could see Mike watching us. Except there were multiple Mikes now, dozens of them, standing just at the edge of visibility, all wearing that same terrible smile, all with those black, empty eyes. "Which one of us do you think will break first?" they said in unison, their voices creating a nauseating harmony. "Which one will invite us in completely?" The clearing continued to shrink. The trees were close enough now that I could feel their bark brushing against my back. Jess was pressed against me, her breathing quick and shallow. "This is a nightmare," she whispered. "This has to be a nightmare." "If only," the mic thing said. "Dreams end when you wake up. This is so much more permanent." One of the figures stepped forward, and I could see that while it looked like Mike, the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. "You brought him to us, Sarah," it said. "Your friend was already broken when he arrived. Hollow. It was so easy to pour ourselves into that empty space." I thought about Mike's divorce, his drinking, the hollow look in his eyes that had been there even before we started hiking. "You're lying," I said. "Am I?" "Think about last night. When did you really last see your friend? When did you last hear him speak in his own voice?" I tried to remember, but the timeline was fuzzy. Had Mike been acting strange before he disappeared? Had there been signs that something was already wrong? "The hunger is patient," the thing continued. "It waits for the right moment, the right weakness. And there's always a weakness, isn't there, Sarah? What's yours?" As if responding to the question, the walls of trees pressed closer. The space around us was now barely large enough for the two of us to stand. Claustrophobia clawed at my throat, that familiar panic from childhood games of hide-and-seek in cramped spaces. "You're afraid of being trapped," the mic thing observed. "Afraid of small spaces, of being unable to escape. How convenient." The trees continued to close in. Soon we'd be pressed between them, crushed or trapped forever in the decreasing space. "Let Jess go," I said. "Take me instead." "Oh, we'll take you both," it replied. "But first, let's see how deep your fears really go." The space became coffin narrow. I could feel bark pressing against my arms, my back, my chest. Jess was hyperventilating beside me, and I could feel my own panic rising. The darkness between the trees was complete now, except for those terrible black eyes watching us from every direction. "Can you feel it?" the thing whispered. "The weight of all that wood? The impossibility of escape? Soon you'll be part of the forest, too. Part of us." I closed my eyes and tried to think. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. I thought about Mike, the real Mike, and tried to remember something he'd said during our first day of hiking. "Weird trees around here. Some of them have these marks." The marks, The symbols carved in the bark. They weren't random. They were some kind of binding, some way of trapping things in this place. Fighting against the claustrophobic pressure, I managed to pull my remaining knife from my boot. The blade was small, but it was sharp. "What are you doing?" Jess gasped. "Fighting back," I said. I drove the blade into the bark of the tree pressed against my back, right through one of the carved symbols. The tree shuddered, and for a moment the pressure lessened. The mic things shrieked in unison, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "You don't understand," they said. "You'll destroy everything. You'll let the hunger loose." I twisted the knife, carving through more of the symbols. The tree began to bleed. Actual blood, dark and thick, seeping from the wounds I'd made. The pressure around us suddenly released. The trees sprang back to their normal positions, leaving us standing in a clearing that was once again normal-sized. But the mic things were advancing now, no longer content to watch from the shadows. "You've broken the binding," they said, their voices layered with rage and something else. "Fear? Now nothing can contain what lives here." "Good," I said, grabbing Jess's hand. "Maybe it's time for a change." We ran again, but this time something was different. The forest no longer felt like a maze designed to trap us. The trees stood in their normal positions, and I could see genuine gaps between them. Escape routes. Behind us, the mic things gave chase, but they moved strangely now, as if the damage to the symbols had affected their ability to maintain physical form. They flickered in and out of visibility, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent. "This way," I called to Jess, spotting what looked like a genuine trail. We followed it downhill, running when we could, walking fast when the terrain was too rough. As we descended, the forest began to sound normal again. Bird calls, insect buzzes, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "Sarah," Jess said as we paused to catch our breath. "Look." She was pointing back up the hill toward the area we'd just left. I could see it now. A section of forest that looked dead. The trees were gray and leafless, twisted into unnatural shapes. It stood out against the healthy green forest around it like a scar. "How did we not see that before?" I asked. "I think we weren't supposed to," Jess said. "I think it was hidden somehow." We made it back to the car just as the sun was setting. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but eventually the engine turned over and we were driving back down Highway 26 toward civilization. We didn't talk much during the drive. What was there to say? We'd report Mike missing, of course. Search teams would look for him. They'd find our abandoned campsite and probably assume he'd fallen into a ravine or been attacked by an animal. They'd never find his body because there wasn't one anymore. Whatever had taken him, whatever had worn his shape for those terrible hours, was something that didn't leave physical remains. We did report him missing. We talked to rangers and search teams and police. They asked the right questions and wrote the right reports and launched the kind of professional search operation that should have found something. Anything. But they found nothing. Our campsite was there, with our abandoned gear scattered around. But there was no sign of Mike, no blood, no trail. It was as if he'd simply vanished. The only thing they couldn't explain was the trees. The search team leader mentioned it in passing. A section of forest that looked like it had been hit by disease or fire, though there was no record of either. "Strangest thing," he said. "Looks like something just killed about an acre of old-growth forest overnight." Jess and I never talked about what really happened up there. What would be the point? Who would believe us? We told the investigators that Mike had wandered off in the night and we'd never seen him again. Technically, that was true, but I still have nightmares about those black eyes and that too-wide smile. I wake up sometimes thinking I can hear his voice calling my name from somewhere far away. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch glimpses of him in my peripheral vision, standing by the side of the road, watching me pass, still smiling that terrible smile. The worst part is the doubt that creeps in during my darkest moments. The question that keeps me awake at night. What if we didn't escape? What if we're still up there, trapped in that contracting circle of trees, and everything since then has been just another layer of the nightmare? What if the thing that came back wearing Mike's face was right, and you really can't run from what's already inside? I try not to think about it. I try to live my normal life, go to work, see friends, pretend that the world is still the safe, rational place I thought it was before we went hiking in the salmon-huckleberry wilderness. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I catch myself listening for the sound of footsteps circling my house. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear them. The trees remember everything, Mike had said. Every person who's walked through here, every fear, every secret, every moment of desperation. I think they remember me too, and I think they're still hungry. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in September 2024, but I suspect it's still happening. Some things don't end just because you walk away from them. Some things follow you home. My name is James Anderson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon 3 weeks ago, though it feels like a lifetime has passed since then. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS started glitching on Highway 26, the digital map fracturing into impossible geometries that hurt to look at. Michael Williams, my college roommate and hiking partner for the past decade, laughed it off from the passenger seat. Technology, right? We've got paper maps, James. We're not exactly charting new territory here. Sarah Rodriguez, squeezed into the back seat of my Honda Civic alongside our camping gear, leaned forward between us. Maybe it's a sign we should turn around, head back to Portland, grab some beers, call it a weekend. She was joking, but I caught something in her voice, a tremor that made me glance at her in the rearview mirror. Her dark eyes were fixed on the dense Douglas fir forest rushing past us, and her usually confident expression seemed strained. "Come on, Sarah," Michael said, turning to grin at her. "You're the one who picked this trail. Lost Lake Loop, remember? Hidden gem, you called it. Hardly anyone knows about it." She forced a smile. "Right. Yeah, it'll be great." But as we pulled into the nearly empty trailhead parking lot, gravel crunching under our tires, I wondered if Sarah's instincts had been trying to warn us about something her rational mind couldn't yet process. The lot could have held 30 cars easily, but ours was one of only 3 vehicles. The others looked like they'd been there for days, maybe weeks, dust coating their windshields, pine needles scattered across their hoods like offerings to some woodland deity. The air hit us with a crisp bite when we climbed out, carrying the scent of moss and decomposing leaves, underlaid with something else I couldn't quite identify. Something that made my nostrils flare with unconscious alarm. Michael stretched his arms above his head, his joints popping audibly in the silence. "God, it's quiet," he said, shouldering his pack. "When's the last time you heard actual silence?" He was right. The forest around us seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no distant hum of traffic from the highway we'd just left. Even our voices seemed muffled, as if the towering trees were swallowing our words before they could travel far. Sarah checked her phone, frowning. "No signal, not even one bar." "Good," Michael said. "Forced digital detox. Just what we need." I studied the trailhead sign. Weathered wood carved with a map that seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. The Lost Lake Loop was marked as a moderate 8.2-mile hike, estimated time 6 to 7 hours. But something about the way the trail twisted and doubled back on itself on the map made my eyes water when I tried to follow its path. "You sure about this trail, Sarah?" I asked. "Looks complicated." She was staring into the forest, her face pale. "I read about it online. Supposed to be beautiful. Remote." She paused, then added quietly, "Maybe too remote." Michael was already adjusting his pack straps, eager to get moving. "We've done harder hikes than this. Remember Mount Washington? This is nothing." He gestured toward the trailhead. "Besides, we're losing daylight. Let's get a few miles in before we make camp." The trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained dirt path winding through towering, old-growth forest. Massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks created a canopy so dense that the afternoon sun reached us only in scattered coins of light. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the packed earth, and I found myself unconsciously trying to walk more quietly. For the first hour, we fell into our usual hiking rhythm. Michael led, setting a steady pace and pointing out interesting trees or rock formations. Sarah and I followed, occasionally making small talk about work, mutual friends, weekend plans. Normal conversation that felt increasingly surreal in the cathedral silence of the forest. But gradually, subtly, things began to feel wrong. It started with the compass. Michael stopped about 2 miles in, frowning at the small device clipped to his pack strap. "That's weird," he muttered. "Compass says we're heading southeast, but according to the map, we should be going northwest to reach the lake." I pulled out my own compass, a reliable Silva model I'd owned for years. The needle spun lazily for a moment before settling on southeast. Maybe there's iron ore in the area, magnetic interference. Sarah checked her phone's compass app, though the screen remained stubbornly dark. No signal, no GPS. Mine's not even working. Dead battery, I think, even though I charged it last night. We consulted the paper map, but in the shifting forest light, the lines seemed to blur and reorganize themselves. What had appeared as a simple loop trail now looked like a labyrinth of interconnected paths, with our current location impossible to determine. "We'll just follow the main trail," Michael said with forced confidence. "All these loops connect eventually. We can't get that lost." But 20 minutes later, we reached a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on any of our maps. 2 paths diverged into the forest, both looking equally well-maintained, both disappearing into the green shadows ahead. No trail markers, no signs, no indication of which direction led where. "Left or right?" Michael asked, but his usual decisiveness was gone. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he'd heard something following us. "Right," Sarah said immediately, then seemed startled by her own certainty. "I mean, right feels correct." So we went right, deeper into forest that seemed to grow more alien with each step. The trees were older here, their trunks scarred with deep grooves that looked almost like claw marks. Lichen hung from the branches in gray-green curtains, and when the wind stirred them, they whispered secrets in a language I didn't want to understand. The light was fading faster than it should have. According to my watch, it was only 4:30 p.m., but the forest around us had taken on the deep shadows of evening. Above us, through gaps in the canopy, I could see patches of sky that seemed wrong somehow. Too dark, with stars beginning to appear even though sunset was still hours away. "We should find a place to camp," I said, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "Get set up before it gets too dark." "There," Sarah pointed to a small clearing just off the trail, maybe 50 feet into the forest. "That looks perfect." The clearing was too perfect, I realized as we bushwhacked toward it. A nearly perfect circle of flat ground, surrounded by trees that formed an almost deliberate perimeter. The grass in the center was thick and soft, unmarked by the usual forest debris. It felt like a stage set, waiting for actors to take their places. But we were tired, and the alternative was hiking in darkness through unfamiliar forest, so we made camp. Michael and I set up our tents while Sarah gathered firewood, though she had to venture increasingly far from the clearing to find fallen branches. The surrounding trees seemed to have been picked clean, as if previous campers had stripped them bare. "Weird," she said, dumping an armload of wood near the fire ring we'd constructed. "It's like someone collected all the easy wood already. But there's no sign anyone's camped here recently." The firewood itself was strange, dry despite the damp forest air, and when Michael struck a match to light it, the flames burned with an odd blue tinge that made our faces look ghostly in the gathering darkness. "Probably just the wood type," he said, but he kept staring at the flames with a troubled expression. "Some species burn different colors." We cooked dinner over the strangely burning fire, freeze-dried pasta that tasted like cardboard despite our hunger. The silence around us had deepened as night fell, becoming so complete it felt oppressive. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, just the snap and hiss of our fire and the sound of our own breathing. "This is nice," Sarah said, but her voice was hollow. She kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Peaceful." "Yeah," Michael agreed, but he'd moved his sleeping bag closer to the fire, and I noticed he kept his flashlight within easy reach. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, telling myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliar environment, the way deep forest could play tricks on city-dweller minds. But as the night deepened, the feeling only intensified. Around 10 p.m., we heard the first sound. It came from somewhere in the forest, a low moan that could have been wind in the trees, but the air was still. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, rising and falling like a lament before cutting off abruptly. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. Michael grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the source of the sound. The light seemed to die just a few feet from our clearing, swallowed by darkness that felt almost solid. "Animal," he said, but his voice was tight. "Elk, maybe, or a bear." The sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably not animal. It was human, or something that had once been human. A voice calling out in wordless anguish, speaking syllables that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce. "We should put out the fire," I said, "not attract attention." But when Michael kicked dirt over the flames, the darkness that rushed in to fill the clearing felt hungry. We huddled in our sleeping bags, flashlights clutched in sweaty hands, listening to that terrible voice call out from different positions around our camp. Sometimes it sounded like a child crying, sometimes like an old woman keening for the dead, sometimes like all the voices of everyone who had ever been lost in these woods calling out together. "It's just one person," Sarah whispered. "Has to be. Someone lost, trying to find help." But the voice was coming from multiple directions now, as if its owner was circling our camp at impossible speed, or as if there were many of them, hidden in the trees, taking turns with their awful song. I don't know when I finally fell asleep, exhaustion overcoming terror. But I woke to gray dawn light and the smell of coffee brewing. Michael was crouched by a rekindled fire, our camp stove hissing beside him. "Morning," he said, but his eyes were hollow with exhaustion. "Sleep well?" I sat up, looking around the clearing. Sarah's tent was still zipped shut, no movement from inside. "She okay?" Michael glanced toward her tent, frowning. "Haven't heard from her yet. Figured I'd let her sleep." But when I called her name, there was no response. The tent looked deflated somehow, as if nothing was inside. Michael and I exchanged worried glances before unzipping the door. The tent was empty. Not just empty, it looked like it had never been occupied. Sarah's sleeping bag was laid out flat, no impression where a body should have been. Her backpack was there, neatly positioned against the tent wall, but when I opened it, half her supplies were missing. The clothes that remained were damp and smelled of earth and decay. "She must have gotten up early," Michael said, but he was already pulling on his boots. "Gone for a walk or something." We searched the clearing, calling her name, looking for footprints or any sign of which direction she'd gone. But the ground around our camp showed no tracks except our own from the previous evening. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished into the morning air. "Her footprints from yesterday," I said, studying the ground near the fire ring. "They just stop." Michael knelt beside me, examining the soft earth. He was right. Sarah's boot prints, clearly visible from when she'd gathered firewood, simply ended a few feet from where her tent had been. Not like she'd walked away in a different direction, but like she'd ceased to exist mid-step. We spent the morning searching, expanding our radius from the camp in careful circles. I tried not to think about how easy it would be to become lost ourselves in this maze of identical trees and shadow. The forest seemed to shift around us as we moved, familiar landmarks disappearing when we turned our backs, new paths appearing where none had been moments before. "Sarah!" Michael called out, his voice echoing strangely in the muffled air. "Sarah, where are you?" And then, impossibly, we heard her voice calling back. "Over here! I'm over here!" The voice came from somewhere ahead of us, maybe 100 yards deeper into the forest. We crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, relief flooding through me. She was alive. She was okay. There would be a rational explanation for her disappearance. But when we found her, standing in a small grove of ancient cedars, something was wrong. Sarah stood perfectly still, her back to us, staring up at the canopy above. She was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, but they looked different somehow, cleaner, newer, as if she'd just put them on. Her hair, which had been pulled back in a messy ponytail, now hung loose around her shoulders in perfect waves. "Sarah?" I called out. "Thank God, we were worried sick. Where did you go?" She turned to face us, and my blood went cold. It was Sarah's face, but not quite right. The features were all there, her dark eyes, her nose, her mouth, but they seemed slightly off, like a photograph that had been subtly altered. Her skin was too pale, too smooth, without the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. And her eyes didn't blink. "I went for a walk," she said, and her voice was Sarah's voice, but flatter somehow, lacking the warmth and animation that made it distinctly hers. "I wanted to see the sunrise." "Your tent," Michael said, studying her face with growing unease. "It looked like you'd never slept in it." Sarah, or the thing wearing Sarah's face, smiled, but the expression didn't reach those unblinking eyes. "I'm a restless sleeper. I probably just smoothed everything out when I got up." The explanation was reasonable, but everything about her felt wrong. The way she stood too still, like a statue pretending to be human. The way her breathing seemed too regular, too controlled. The way she kept staring at us without ever looking away, as if she was memorizing our faces. "We should head back to camp," I said, not wanting to spend another moment in this grove that suddenly felt like a trap. "Break everything down. Get back to the trail." "Of course," Sarah said. "Lead the way." But as we walked back toward our clearing, I kept glancing over my shoulder at her. She moved differently now, too fluid, too graceful, like she was floating just slightly above the ground. And when branches or thorns caught at her clothes, they seemed to pass right through her without leaving a mark. Back at camp, we packed our gear in uneasy silence. I watched Sarah roll up her sleeping bag, the same sleeping bag that had been flat and unused when we'd found her tent empty, and stuff it into her pack with mechanical precision. No wasted movements, no casual gestures, nothing that suggested genuine human behavior. "You sure you're feeling okay?" Michael asked her as we shouldered our packs. "You seem different." Those unblinking eyes fixed on him, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind them, something hungry and patient and utterly inhuman. "I feel perfect," she said, "better than I've ever felt." We rejoined what we thought was the main trail, but the path we'd followed the day before seemed to have changed overnight. The fork where we'd chosen to go right was gone, replaced by a single trail that curved away into the forest in a direction that felt fundamentally wrong. When I checked my compass, the needle spun wildly before pointing toward magnetic north, which, according to my internal sense of direction, was now behind us. "Did we take a wrong turn?" Michael muttered, studying the paper map that seemed to show different details every time I looked at it. "This doesn't match what I remember." "We're fine," Sarah said from behind us. "Just keep walking." Her voice carried a subtle authority that made both Michael and me unconsciously obey, even though every instinct screamed that we were walking deeper into danger. The forest around us grew darker and more twisted as we hiked, the trees pressing closer to the trail, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it was like walking through a tunnel. Hours passed, though my watch seemed to disagree with the sun's position overhead. According to the timepiece, it was barely noon, but the light filtering down to us had the deep golden quality of late afternoon. We should have been getting hungry, should have stopped for lunch, but none of us mentioned food. I realized I hadn't felt hungry since waking up, hadn't felt thirsty, hadn't felt much of anything except a growing sense of wrongness. "How much farther to the lake?" Michael asked, but his voice sounded distant, as if he was speaking from the far end of a long tunnel. "Not far," Sarah replied. "Just keep walking." And we did keep walking, because stopping felt impossible, like fighting against a current that would sweep us away if we lost momentum. The trail wound deeper into forest that no longer resembled the Oregon wilderness I knew. The trees were wrong, too tall, too gnarled, their bark scarred with symbols that might have been natural or might have been carved by something with very sharp claws. It was Michael who finally broke the spell. We'd been walking for what felt like hours when he suddenly stopped, swaying slightly on his feet. "This is wrong," he said, his voice thick and confused, like someone waking from a dream. "All of this is wrong. Where are we?" I looked around, seeing the forest clearly for the first time since we'd left camp. We were no longer on any trail. We stood in a grove of dead trees, their leafless branches reaching toward a sky that was the color of old bruises. The ground beneath our feet was covered with a thick layer of leaves that squelched wetly with each step, as if the earth underneath was rotting. "Sarah," I said, turning to look at our companion. "Where are we? What is this place?" But the thing wearing Sarah's face was no longer pretending to be human. Its features had shifted, becoming angular and predatory. Its skin had taken on a gray-green pallor, and when it smiled I saw that its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "You wanted to go hiking," it said, and its voice was still Sarah's voice but layered now with harmonics that made my bones ache. "You wanted to explore the wilderness, so explore." Michael took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife on his belt. "What did you do with Sarah? Where is she?" The thing's smile widened and I saw something move behind its eyes, something vast and hungry that had been wearing Sarah's identity like a mask. "Sarah went for a walk," it said. "She's still walking. She'll always be walking." That's when Michael lunged, pulling his knife from its sheath and driving it toward the thing's chest. But the blade passed through its body as if it were made of mist, and Michael stumbled forward, off balance. The creature reached out with hands that were no longer quite human, fingers too long, nails too sharp, and touched Michael's face with almost gentle tenderness. "Sleep," it whispered, and Michael's eyes rolled back in his head. He collapsed to the rotting ground, his body convulsing once before going still. I ran. I crashed through the dead forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face, the thing's laughter echoing behind me like wind chimes made of bone. The trees seemed to move to block my path, their branches reaching down to snare me, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, I heard Michael scream, not in pain, but in a voice that was no longer his own. When I risked a glance over my shoulder, I saw him standing again. But his posture was wrong, his movements too fluid, too predatory. The thing had taken him just as it had taken Sarah, adding his form to its collection of masks. I don't know how long I ran, or how I finally found my way back to something resembling the real world. The forest seemed to shift and change around me as I fled, sometimes showing me familiar landmarks, sometimes trapping me in mazes of identical trees. My phone remained dead, my compass spun uselessly, and the sun seemed to move across the sky in impossible directions. But eventually, impossibly, I stumbled out of the tree line and found myself in the parking lot where we'd started our hike. My Honda Civic sat exactly where I'd left it, covered with pine needles as if it had been there for weeks rather than hours. The other cars were gone. I drove back to Portland in a state of shock, my mind struggling to process what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to call the police, to report Michael and Sarah missing, to organize a search and rescue operation. But how could I explain what I'd seen? How could I describe the thing that had worn their faces, the forest that had changed around us like a living maze? In the end, I told the authorities that my friends had decided to continue hiking while I returned home early due to illness. I filed missing person reports, participated in the search efforts, even hired a private investigator. But I knew they would never be found. Not the real Michael and Sarah. Whatever had taken them was still out there in those woods, wearing their shapes, adding their voices to its collection. Sometimes, late at night, I get calls from numbers I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear familiar voices. Sarah laughing about something funny at work. Michael telling me about a great new restaurant he's discovered. They always want to meet up, want me to come join them for another adventure. "Come hiking with us, James," they say, their voices warm and inviting and perfectly wrong. "We found the most beautiful trail. You'd love it." I never answer those calls anymore. I've moved 3 times, changed my phone number twice, but they always find me. Because I know what's really calling. That thing in the forest, still wearing the faces of my friends, still hungry for more masks to add to its collection. Last week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written in Sarah's careful handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. Michael and Sarah standing in that clearing where we'd made camp, smiling at the camera with 2 wide grins and eyes that didn't blink. Written on the back, in Michael's distinctive scrawl, were 4 words that made my blood freeze. "Come find us, James." I've started having dreams about that forest, about the trail that leads nowhere and everywhere at once. In the dreams, I'm walking back toward that grove of dead trees, and I can hear my friends calling out to me, their voices full of love and longing and terrible hunger. Sometimes I wake up in my car, dressed in hiking gear, heading east toward Mount Hood on Highway 26. My phone's GPS is always glitching, showing impossible routes through forests that exist only in nightmares, and in the passenger seat, there's always a paper map, one that shows trails that aren't on any official chart, paths that lead to clearings where things that were once human wait patiently for new friends to join their eternal hike. I turn around every time, drive back home, throw away the map, try to convince myself it was just a dream or a moment of sleepwalking. But each time, it gets harder to resist the pull. Each time, I drive a little farther before turning back. Because part of me wants to see them again. The real Michael and Sarah. Not the things wearing their faces. Part of me believes that if I could just find that grove again, I could somehow save them, bring them back to the world they'd been stolen from. But mostly, I think I'm just tired of being alone with this knowledge, this terrible secret that no one would believe. And when I finally give in, because I know I will eventually, when I finally follow that map all the way to its destination, at least I won't be alone anymore. At least I'll have my friends back, even if they're not quite the friends I remember. The phone is ringing again as I write this. Sarah's number showing on the caller ID, though I know Sarah Rodriguez died in those woods 3 weeks ago. I can hear her voice through the phone's speaker, warm and familiar and wrong in ways that make my skin crawl. "James," she's saying. "James, are you there? We've been waiting for you. We found the most beautiful place and we want to share it with you. Just follow the trail. You remember the trail, don't you?" My hand is reaching for the phone. I can feel myself wanting to answer, wanting to hear more of that voice that sounds so much like my friend but isn't, will never be again. Outside my window, I can see the dark line of the Cascade Range against the evening sky. Somewhere out there, in forests that exist between the spaces on maps, things that were once human are walking eternal trails, collecting faces and voices and memories from anyone foolish enough to follow paths that lead nowhere good. The phone stops ringing. In the sudden silence, I hear something else. Footsteps outside my apartment. Familiar voices calling my name from the hallway. They've come to collect me in person. I should run. I should call the police, should scream, should do anything except what I know I'm about to do. But the truth is, I'm tired of running. Tired of the nightmares, tired of the guilt, tired of being the only one who knows what really happened in those woods. The footsteps are getting closer. I can hear Michael's laugh, Sarah's voice saying my name with that flat, wrong intonation that makes my teeth ache. They've found me, just like I always knew they would. Maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe being one of them will be better than being alone with this knowledge. Maybe I'll finally stop having dreams about forests that shouldn't exist and friends who died in ways the world isn't ready to understand. The doorknob is turning. I'm going to answer it. I'm going to go home. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon, 3 weeks after my life fell apart for the second time. The first time was when Marcus left. The second was when I lost my job at the environmental consulting firm, supposedly due to budget cuts, but really because I'd been showing up late, distracted, unable to focus on soil contamination reports when my world had crumbled. I needed to get away, to think, to breathe air that didn't smell like the stale disappointment of my Portland apartment. Rex, my German Shepherd mix, sensed my mood as I loaded the Subaru. His amber eyes tracked my movements with the intensity he usually reserved for squirrels. At 3 years old, he was my most reliable relationship, the only male who hadn't abandoned me when things got difficult. "Just you and me, boy," I told him, scratching behind his ears. His tail wagged once, uncertain. Rex was always sensitive to my emotional state, but lately he'd been more anxious than usual, whining at empty corners of the apartment, refusing to sleep in his usual spot by my bed. The plan was simple. 3 days on the Timberline Trail, a section I'd hiked before but never alone. The October weather promised crisp days and cold nights, perfect for clearing my head. I'd packed enough food for 4 days, just in case, plus Rex's kibble and my father's old compass, a talisman from my childhood camping trips before he died. The drive up Highway 26 felt different this time. Maybe it was the isolation I craved, or maybe it was the way the Douglas firs seemed to lean inward, creating tunnels of shadow despite the afternoon sun. Rex panted heavily in the back seat, something he never did on car rides. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was staring out the back window, body rigid. "What is it, boy?" He didn't respond, just continued that intense stare at the empty road behind us. I parked at the Timberline Lodge trailhead around 3 p.m. The lot was nearly empty, just a rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been there for weeks and a newer Honda Civic with California plates. Good. Fewer people meant more solitude. The first mile of trail was familiar, winding through old-growth forest thick with western hemlock and noble fir. Rex trotted ahead, nose to the ground, but his usual enthusiasm seemed forced. Every few minutes he'd stop and look back the way we'd come, ears pricked forward. Just hikers, Rex, or maybe a deer. But when I followed his gaze, I saw nothing but trail and trees and the shadows that gathered between them like pools of black water. The GPS on my phone worked fine initially, showing our steady progress along the marked trail. I'd downloaded offline maps, paranoid about losing signal, but the blue dot tracked smoothly through the green topography. The temperature held steady in the mid-50s, perfect hiking weather. It was around mile 3 when things began to feel wrong. Rex had been ranging ahead as usual, disappearing around bends and returning with his tongue lolling in a grin. But suddenly he was at my heel, pressing against my leg with a whine that raised the hair on my arms. The forest had gone quiet. Not just bird quiet, everything quiet. No insect hum, no squirrel chatter, no whisper of wind through needles. I pulled out my phone to check our position and frowned. The GPS showed our location, but the blue dot was flickering, jumping between 2 positions about 50 yards apart. I tried refreshing the app, but the same glitch persisted. Probably just poor signal, I muttered, but my voice sounded thin in the unnatural silence. That's when I heard it. A child crying, somewhere ahead and to the left of the trail. Rex's reaction was immediate and terrifying. His hackles rose, a ridge of bristling fur from neck to tail, and he backed against my legs with a low growl I'd never heard from him before. It was a sound of pure fear. The crying continued, hiccuping sobs that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. My rational mind catalogued possibilities. Lost hiker, injured child, maybe just an animal that sounded human. But my body knew better. Every primitive instinct screamed danger. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped instantly, as if cut with a knife. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Rex was trembling now, something I'd only seen during thunderstorms. I knelt beside him, running my hands through his fur, feeling the rapid pound of his heart. "It's okay, boy. We're okay." But I wasn't sure I believed it. I considered turning back, but we were already 3 miles in, and the crying had probably been nothing more than wind through the trees or a bird I didn't recognize. I'd been jumpy lately, seeing threats where none existed. Marcus used to tease me about my overactive imagination. We pressed on, Rex glued to my side. The trail curved around a massive outcropping of volcanic rock, and I checked my phone again. The GPS had stabilized, but now it showed us in a completely different location. Somehow, we were half a mile north of where we should have been, according to the map. That was impossible. The trail was well marked, and I'd been following it religiously. I pulled out my father's compass, a beautiful brass piece that had never failed me. The needle spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north. I tapped the glass, thinking maybe condensation had affected it, but the needle continued its aimless wandering. "Equipment failure," I said aloud, needing to hear my own voice. "Happens all the time." Rex whined and pressed closer. The sun was getting lower, painting the forest in shades of amber and rust. According to my watch, it was only 5 p.m., but the light felt wrong. Too dim, too orange, like the sky just before a storm that never came. I decided to make camp early, at a clearing that appeared around the next bend. It wasn't one of the designated camping areas marked on my map, but it was level and protected by a ring of towering pines. A small stream gurgled nearby, providing fresh water. As I set up my tent, Rex investigated the perimeter with professional thoroughness, but his tail remained low, never wagging. Usually, he loved camping. All the new smells and sounds were like Christmas morning for his senses. Tonight, he acted like a guard dog in enemy territory. I tried to light my camp stove for dinner, but the fuel wouldn't catch. I checked the connection, tried a different setting, even replaced the igniter. Nothing. The flame would spark but never hold, as if the air itself was rejecting fire. "Come on," I muttered, trying for the 10th time. For just a moment the gas caught, but the flame burned blue instead of the normal orange-yellow. It flickered for perhaps 3 seconds before dying. My hands were shaking as I dug out my backup lighter and tried to start a campfire with the wood I'd gathered. Dry pine needles, seasoned tinder, everything perfect for a quick flame. But even with the lighter's steady flame touching the kindling, nothing caught. The wood seemed to repel fire like wet bark, though it was bone dry to the touch. Rex had positioned himself at the edge of our small camp, facing outward into the darkening forest. He hadn't eaten his dinner, hadn't even sniffed it. Unprecedented behavior for a dog who usually inhaled his food. As darkness fell, I gave up on fire and ate cold trail mix for dinner, washing it down with stream water that tasted faintly metallic. Rex finally accepted a few pieces of jerky from my hand, but his eyes never left the tree line. I tried to read by headlamp, but the words swam on the page. Every few minutes I found myself looking up, certain I'd heard something moving in the forest beyond our clearing. But my light revealed only trees and shadows, and the occasional gleam of eyes that might have been nocturnal animals, or might have been something else entirely. Around 10 p.m., Rex suddenly stood, every muscle tense. His ears pricked forward, rotating like radar dishes. Then I heard it too. Footsteps. Human footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too light, like someone walking on tiptoes, trying not to be heard but failing. "Hello?" I called into the darkness beyond my headlamp beam. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Rex began to growl, a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that looked longer and sharper in the harsh LED light. "It's okay," I whispered as much to myself as to him. "Just another hiker. People camp out here all the time." But no response came from the darkness, and the footsteps didn't resume. Whatever was out there was waiting, listening, watching. I unzipped my sleeping bag and gestured for Rex to join me. Usually, he slept outside the tent, preferring the fresh air. Tonight, he scrambled inside immediately, pressing his full weight against me as I zipped us in. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by Rex's occasional whines and the sense that something was circling our camp just beyond the range of hearing. Twice I woke to find him staring at the tent wall, hackles raised, but when I listened, there was only silence. The third time I woke, Rex was gone. I sat up in my sleeping bag, disoriented. The tent felt impossibly large without his warm bulk beside me. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. The tent zipper was closed, exactly as I'd left it. "Rex?" I whispered, then louder. "Rex?" No response. No sound of him moving around outside the tent. I fumbled for my headlamp and unzipped the tent flap. The clearing was empty, my campsite undisturbed. Rex's food bowl sat where I'd placed it, still half full. But there was no sign of my dog anywhere. Panic fluttered in my chest. Rex would never leave me voluntarily, especially not in a place that had him so on edge. I called his name again and again, my voice echoing strangely in the forest, as if the trees were swallowing the sound. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and began searching the perimeter of our camp. No tracks in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no indication of which direction he might have gone. The forest seemed different at night, larger, hungrier. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness between the trees, creating a small bubble of yellow light that made everything beyond it seem infinite. Each step took me further from the safety of my tent, but I couldn't abandon Rex. "Rex! Come here, boy! Rex!" The silence that answered was not the peaceful quiet of sleeping woods. It was the silence of something holding its breath, waiting. I must have searched for an hour, moving in ever-widening circles around the campsite, my light stabbing into shadows that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. No Rex, no trace of Rex. It was as if he had simply vanished. Exhausted and near tears, I returned to my tent. I left the rain fly partially open so I could hear him if he came back, and lay in my sleeping bag staring at the patch of stars visible through the opening. They looked wrong, too bright, in patterns I didn't recognize. I must have dozed because I woke to the sound of Rex barking. Joyful, excited barking, the sound he made when greeting me after a long day at work. "Rex!" I called, scrambling out of my sleeping bag. The barking was coming from somewhere past the stream, deeper in the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled toward the sound, branches catching at my jacket, pine needles slippery under my boots. "Rex, where are you, boy?" The barking stopped abruptly, replaced by a low whine. Then silence. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, searching for movement, for the gleam of his eyes or his pale chest markings. Instead, I saw him standing about 30 yards away, just at the edge of my light. "Rex!" He was facing away from me, head cocked as if listening to something I couldn't hear. His posture was strange. Too still, like a statue of a dog rather than a living animal. "Come here, boy." He turned toward me and my breath caught. Something was wrong with his face. In the harsh LED light, his expression looked almost human, too intelligent, too aware. His mouth hung open in what might have been a grin, but dogs don't grin like that. Dogs don't look at you with that kind of calculating interest. "Rex?" He approached slowly, tail wagging, but the movement seemed mechanical. Each step was precise, deliberate, like someone pretending to be a dog but not quite getting the details right. Relief warred with unease as he reached me. He looked like Rex, same markings, same size, same amber eyes. But when I reached out to pet him, he flinched away from my touch, something my dog had never done. "What's wrong, boy? Are you hurt?" He followed me back to camp, staying several feet behind instead of ranging ahead as usual. When we reached the tent, he sat outside rather than coming in, watching me with those too intelligent eyes. I tried to sleep, but every time I looked toward the tent opening, he was there, sitting, watching. Never moving, never blinking, just staring at me with patient intensity. When morning came, I was exhausted and deeply unsettled. Rex, or the thing that looked like Rex, was exactly where he'd been all night, sitting like a sentry outside my tent. When I emerged, he stood and wagged his tail, but the movement seemed rehearsed. "Good morning, boy," I said carefully. He tilted his head at the sound of my voice, but didn't respond otherwise. No excited jumping, no morning enthusiasm, no attempt to lick my face. Just that steady, unblinking stare. I broke camp quickly, eager to return to the trailhead. Whatever had happened to Rex in the night, injury, shock, maybe just getting lost and scared, I needed to get him to a vet. The way he was acting wasn't natural. But when I shouldered my pack and started toward the trail, he didn't follow. He remained sitting in the middle of our campsite, watching me with those calculating eyes. "Come on, Rex. We're going home." He stood slowly, but instead of coming toward me, he walked to the edge of the clearing and sat down again, waiting. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't Rex. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't my dog. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the creature that wore Rex's form. Its head turned to track my movement, and for just a moment, I could have sworn it smiled. I ran. The trail seemed different in daylight, twisting in directions I didn't remember. My GPS was completely useless now, showing nothing but a blank gray screen no matter how many times I restarted the app. The compass needle spun wildly, sometimes pointing in opposite directions within seconds. Behind me, I could hear footsteps. Not the four-legged gait of a dog, but the measured steps of something walking upright. I didn't look back. The forest pressed in around me, branches reaching across the trail like grasping fingers. The path forked repeatedly, left or right, up or down, and I had no idea which was correct. Every choice felt wrong, leading me deeper into woods that grew thicker and darker with each mile. My watch read 2:30 p.m., but the sun was directly overhead, brutal and white in a sky that had turned the color of old bones. Time was moving wrong, flowing backward or sideways or not at all. The footsteps behind me never got closer, but they never fell behind either. A steady rhythm that matched my pace exactly, staying just far enough back to remain out of sight when I glanced over my shoulder. I stumbled into another clearing, or maybe the same clearing. I couldn't tell anymore. Everything looked familiar and alien at once. A stream gurgled nearby, and I realized I was desperately thirsty. I hadn't drunk anything since the night before. The water tasted like copper and earth, but I drank deeply anyway. As I knelt by the stream, I saw my reflection in the dark water, pale, wild-eyed, hair tangled with pine needles. But there was something else in the reflection, a shadow standing behind me that wasn't there when I turned around. Lost? The voice made me jump, sending me sprawling backward from the stream bank. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, smiling pleasantly. He was maybe 40, wearing expensive hiking gear that looked fresh from the store, too clean for someone who'd been in the woods long enough to reach this remote area. Yes, I think so, I stammered. Do you know the way back to the Timberline Lodge trailhead? His smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. Of course, these woods can be confusing, especially for someone traveling alone. I'm not alone, I said automatically, then realized how that sounded. I mean, I have my dog. He's around here somewhere. Oh, yes, your dog. I've seen him. The man's eyes glittered with amusement. Beautiful animal, very loyal. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. Have you seen him recently? He's been acting strange. Strange how? I don't know. Different, like he's not quite himself. The man nodded sagely. The forest changes things. Changes everyone who stays too long. He gestured toward a barely visible path leading deeper into the trees. "Your dog went that way. Would you like me to help you find him?" Every instinct I had screamed danger, but I was lost, exhausted, and desperate to understand what had happened to Rex. "Yes, please." He led the way down the faint trail, moving with a fluid grace that seemed wrong for the rough terrain. His boots made no sound on the forest floor, and when I looked down I couldn't see his footprints in the soft earth. "You're from Portland?" he asked without turning around. "Yes. How did you—" "Lucky guess. You have that city look about you. Soft." He glanced back at me and his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "The forest isn't kind to soft things." The trail descended steeply, winding between massive trees whose trunks were scarred with symbols I didn't recognize, scratches in the bark that might have been made by claws or knives, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. "What are those marks?" I asked. "Warnings," he said simply. "Or maybe invitations. Depends on how you read them." We walked in silence for several minutes, the forest growing darker despite the afternoon sun. The canopy overhead was so thick it created an artificial twilight, and the air smelled of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of roadkill. "There," the man said, pointing ahead. I saw Rex sitting in the middle of the trail, exactly as he'd been at our campsite. Same position, same unnatural stillness, same too intelligent stare. "Rex," I called, but he didn't react to my voice. "Go to him," the man urged. "He's been waiting for you." I approached cautiously. Up close, the wrongness was even more apparent. This thing looked like Rex, sounded like Rex when it breathed, but everything about it was slightly off. The proportions were wrong. Legs too long, head too large, ears set at an odd angle. "This isn't my dog," I whispered. "No," the man agreed, "but it could be, if you want it to be." I turned to face him, and my blood turned to ice. His face was shifting, features flowing like melted wax. The pleasant smile stretched too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. His eyes had gone completely black, reflecting nothing. "What are you?" "A collector," he said in a voice that wasn't quite human anymore. "I collect lost things, lost people, lost animals, lost souls. This forest is full of them." The thing that looked like Rex stood and began walking toward me. Its movement was all wrong, joints bending in directions they shouldn't, limbs moving independently like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. "Where's my dog?" I demanded, backing away. "Gone," the creature said. "But I can give you something better. Something that will never leave you, never disappoint you, never die. All you have to do is choose." The Rex thing was circling me now, staying just out of reach. Its mouth hung open in that horrible grin, and I could see that its teeth were human teeth, perfectly straight and white. "Choose what?" "Stay here. Become part of the collection. You'll never be alone again, never be abandoned. Your dog will be with you forever. And if I refuse?" His laugh was like breaking glass. "Then you leave. But you leave alone. The thing wearing your dog's face goes with you, and every day you'll wonder if it's really Rex or something else. Every night you'll watch it watching you with those two smart eyes. Every moment will be poisoned by doubt." The Rex thing sat down in front of me, tilting its head with perfect canine curiosity. But its eyes held human malice. I thought of my empty apartment in Portland, my lost job, my ex-boyfriend who'd called me too clingy, too needy, too afraid of being alone. The creature was offering me exactly what I'd always wanted. Someone who would never leave. But the price was everything that made me human. "No," I said quietly. "No, I won't stay." The forest exploded into motion. The trees bent inward like grasping fingers. The ground rippled like water, and the sky turned the color of old blood. The creature that had looked like a man was changing too, growing larger, more angular, its limbs stretching impossibly long. I ran. Behind me, I could hear the thing crashing through the forest. no longer bothering with the pretense of humanity. Its howl shook the trees, a sound like metal tearing and children screaming. The Rex thing ran beside it, keeping pace with movements that were more like flowing water than animal locomotion. The trail ahead split into a dozen different paths, each leading into deeper darkness. I chose one at random and plunged down it, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me. The howling grew closer. Ahead, impossibly, I saw light. Real sunlight, not the sickly glow that had filled the forest since Rex disappeared. I ran toward it with the last of my strength, my lungs burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I burst out of the tree line into the Timberline Lodge parking lot. My Subaru sat exactly where I'd left it, covered in dew as if it had been there overnight instead of for days. The other cars were gone. The lot was empty except for my own vehicle and a park ranger's truck. I stumbled toward my car, fumbling for the keys, not daring to look back at the forest. Behind me, the howling had stopped. The silence was somehow worse. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I spun around to find a park ranger approaching, his face creased with concern. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. Yes, no, I don't know. I was shaking, I realized. My whole body was shaking like I was hypothermic. "You look like you've had quite an experience. Can I help you?" I wanted to tell him everything. About Rex, about the creature in the forest, about the thing that had worn my dog's face. But who would believe such a story? "My dog," I managed. "I lost my dog." His expression softened. "German Shepherd mix? Reddish brown and black?" Hope flared in my chest. "Yes. Have you seen him?" "Found him this morning, actually. He was waiting by your car. Seemed to know exactly where he belonged." The ranger smiled. "He's at the ranger station. We were hoping his owner would turn up." I followed him to his truck in a daze. This had to be real Rex. The creature in the forest had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. People got lost in the woods all the time, saw things that weren't there. My rational mind grabbed onto this explanation desperately. The ranger station was a small building near the lodge. Inside, I heard familiar barking. Joyful, excited, definitely Rex's voice. "Rex!" He came bounding out of the back room, tail wagging furiously every inch the dog I remembered. He jumped up on me, licking my face, whining with happiness. This was Rex. This was my dog. "Thank you," I told the ranger, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you so much. Just glad we could reunite you two. These woods can be dangerous for people who don't know them well. Easy to get turned around." I clipped Rex's leash to his collar and led him to my car. He jumped into the back seat with his usual enthusiasm, immediately sticking his head out the window to catch new smells. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The forest looked normal, just trees and shadows and dappled sunlight. Whatever I'd experienced in there was over. The drive home was blissfully ordinary. Rex panted happily in the back seat, occasionally woofing at passing motorcycles. His behavior was completely normal, completely dog-like. I'd imagined everything else. Stress, isolation, too much time alone, it had all combined to create a waking nightmare that was finally over. That was 3 weeks ago. Rex seems perfectly normal during the day. He eats his food, chases squirrels, greets me enthusiastically when I come home from job interviews. But at night, when he thinks I'm asleep, I sometimes catch him sitting beside my bed, staring at me with those amber eyes. The expression is wrong. Too focused, too intelligent, like he's studying me for reasons I can't understand. And sometimes, just for a moment, I could swear he smiles. I tell myself it's my imagination. Dogs can't smile like that. Dogs don't sit motionless for hours, watching their owners sleep without blinking. Dogs don't tilt their heads and listen when there's nothing to hear. But every morning, I wake up to find the window open, even though I always lock it before bed. And sometimes there are muddy paw prints on the sill. prints that go both in and out, as if something had left during the night and returned before dawn. Last night, I pretended to be asleep and watched him through half-closed eyes. At exactly 3:17 a.m., he stood up and walked to the window. His movements were too fluid, too precise. He opened the latch with his paw, an impossible feat for a dog, and slipped outside. I lay there until morning, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When the sun rose, he was back in his usual spot beside my bed, looking perfectly normal. I don't know what came back from the forest with me. I don't know if Rex is still in there somewhere, or if I'm living with something that's just wearing his shape, but I know one thing for certain. I'm never alone anymore. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I wonder if that's exactly what the creature wanted me to think. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Mount Hood wilderness of Oregon during the first week of November 2023, when the autumn rains had already begun to strip the last stubborn leaves from the vine maples, and the first snow was threatening the higher elevations. I had come to the wilderness seeking solitude after the worst month of my life. My marriage had ended in a spectacular implosion of accusations and lawyers. My photography career was stagnating, and my mother had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. The walls of my Portland apartment felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with the weight of my failures. So I packed my camera gear, loaded up my German Shepherd bear, and headed for the remote sections of the Timberline Trail where cell service died and the modern world couldn't follow. Bear was 3 years old, a magnificent animal with intelligent amber eyes and a coat like burnished copper. He'd been my constant companion since the divorce papers were filed, the only living thing I trusted completely. His presence made the solitude bearable, his loyalty absolute in a world that had proven unreliable. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when we arrived at dawn. November wasn't peak hiking season, and the weather forecast promised 3 days of intermittent rain and possible snow above 4,000 feet. Perfect. I wanted to disappear into the wilderness, to let the forest swallow me until I could remember who I was before everything fell apart. I shouldered my pack, heavy with camera equipment and 3 days' worth of supplies, and clipped Bear's leash to my belt. The trail wound upward through dense Douglas fir and hemlock, their branches heavy with moisture from the morning fog. The familiar weight of my pack and the rhythmic sound of our footsteps on the damp earth began to work their therapeutic magic almost immediately. For the first hour, everything felt normal. The GPS on my phone showed our steady progress along the main trail, and Bear trotted happily beside me, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents but always returning when called. The forest was alive with the sounds of hidden life, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through the canopy. Then the first strange thing happened. I stopped to check our position and found my GPS screen displaying a maze of impossible lines. According to the device, we were somehow standing in 3 different locations simultaneously, and the trail we'd been following for over an hour didn't exist on the digital map. The screen flickered, showing our location jumping erratically across the wilderness like a glitch in reality itself. "That's weird," I muttered, tapping the screen. Bear whined softly and pressed against my leg, his ears pricked forward with unusual alertness. I pulled out my paper map and compass as backup. The compass needle spun lazily, unable to find magnetic north before finally settling on a direction that felt wrong based on the sun's position. But paper maps don't lie, I told myself. I'd follow the physical landmarks and worry about the electronics later. We continued climbing, and within another hour I began to notice that the forest around us had changed. The trees seemed older, more gnarled, their bark darkened with lichen and moss that gave them an almost diseased appearance. The undergrowth grew thicker, more tangled, and the trail itself became less defined, as if it were slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Bear's behavior changed too. He stayed closer to me, no longer interested in investigating the world around us. His hackles would occasionally rise for no apparent reason, and he would stare fixedly into the forest depths, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I asked, following his gaze into the shadowy spaces between the trees. I saw nothing but the endless repetition of trunk and branch, but something about the quality of the silence felt wrong. It was too complete, too heavy, as if the forest were holding its breath. By midday, we reached what should have been Ramona Falls, a spectacular 120-foot cascade that was one of the highlights of this section of trail. Instead, we found a dry stone face with only a few meager trickles of water seeping from cracks in the rock. The pool at the base was mostly empty, filled with rotting leaves and the bones of small animals. The smell hit me then, a cloying, sweet stench of decay that seemed to rise from the stagnant water. Bear whimpered and backed away, refusing to drink despite our long climb. I'd never seen him refuse water before, and his obvious distress sent a chill down my spine. I decided to make camp early, choosing a small clearing about a quarter mile from the failed waterfall. As I set up my tent, I noticed that Bear wouldn't settle. He paced the perimeter of our campsite, pausing frequently to stare into the forest with that same intense focus. The sun set earlier than it should have. I checked my watch repeatedly, certain it was wrong, but by 4:30 p.m., full darkness had fallen despite the fact that sunset shouldn't occur until after 5 The temperature dropped precipitously, and my breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. I struggled to start a fire with increasingly numb fingers, but the matches wouldn't catch properly. Each flame would sputter and die as if smothered by an invisible presence. When I finally managed to coax a small blaze to life, the flames burned with an eerie blue tinge that cast weird shadows and provided no real warmth. That's when I met David. He emerged from the tree line like a figure materializing from shadow, walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in these woods. He was maybe 40, with graying brown hair and the lean build of a serious hiker. His gear looked expensive and well-maintained, and his smile was warm and reassuring. "Rough day for a fire," he said, gesturing toward my struggling campfire. "Mind if I share some warmth? I'm David Clark." Under normal circumstances, I might have been wary of a stranger appearing in the wilderness after dark, but after the day's accumulating strangeness, his normal human presence was deeply comforting. Bear, surprisingly, showed no reaction to him at all. No territorial display, no friendly greeting, nothing. He simply ignored David completely, as if the man weren't there. "Sarah," I replied. "And yes, please, I can't seem to get this fire to behave properly." David knelt beside the fire ring and somehow coaxed the flames back to their normal orange color. The warmth felt real again, and the shadows retreated to more natural positions around our clearing. We shared a simple dinner of trail mix and energy bars, and David proved to be excellent company, knowledgeable about the wilderness, funny and refreshingly normal after the day's weirdness. "You picked an interesting time to be out here," he said as we watched the flames dance. "These old forests have their moods, especially when the weather turns." "Old forests?" "Oh yes, this section of the Cascades is ancient. Native tribes considered these particular woods sacred and dangerous. They had stories about travelers who would come back from the deep forest, changed." I laughed nervously. "Changed how?" David's expression grew serious in the firelight. The stories varied, but the theme was consistent. People would go missing for days, then return to their tribes acting strange, wrong, like something else was wearing their skin. A log collapsed in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks, and in that moment I noticed something odd about David. His pupils reflected the firelight like an animal's, gleaming with an internal luminescence that made my stomach clench with instinctual fear. But when I blinked and looked again, his eyes appeared completely normal. We talked for another hour before David announced he needed to check his gear and disappeared into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Bear, who had been lying quietly during our conversation, immediately became agitated. He paced the campsite perimeter again, whining softly, and when I called for him to settle down, he fixed me with a look of such obvious distress that I felt guilty for not understanding what he was trying to tell me. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., exhausted by the day's strange events. Bear settled outside the tent entrance, his usual position when we camped, but I could hear him shifting restlessly throughout the night. Several times I was awakened by his low growls, and once by the sound of him scrambling to his feet with a sharp bark that suggested alarm. "Bear? What is it?" I whispered, but he had fallen silent again. I must have finally fallen into deep sleep near dawn, because I was awakened by bright sunlight filtering through the tent walls and the sound of something moving around our campsite. I checked my watch, 11:30 a.m. I'd slept for over 12 hours, far longer than usual, and felt groggy and disoriented. I unzipped the tent and crawled out to find David crouched beside the dead remains of our fire, poking at the cold ashes with a stick. Bear was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my dog?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. David looked up with that same warm smile. "Oh, he wandered off about an hour ago, probably chasing a squirrel or something. He'll be back." But Bear never wandered off. Never. In 3 years, he had never once left my side while camping, and the fact that David seemed unconcerned about this alarmed me more than I wanted to admit. I called Bear's name repeatedly while I broke camp, growing more anxious with each unanswered shout. David helped me pack, chattering cheerfully about the day's hiking prospects, but his casual attitude about my missing dog felt increasingly wrong. "Maybe we should wait for him," I suggested. "Dogs know their way around the woods better than we do," David replied. "He'll catch up. These forests can be confusing for humans, but animals have better instincts." Something about the way he said humans made my skin crawl, but I couldn't articulate why. We set off on what David claimed was a shortcut to rejoin the main trail, but within an hour I realized we were traveling deeper into unmarked wilderness, following game trails that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. My GPS had completely failed, showing nothing but a blank screen, and my compass now spun freely without ever settling on a direction. When I mentioned this to David, he laughed. "Electronics never work properly out here. Something about the mineral content in the rocks, I think. Best to trust your instincts." But my instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The forest around us had taken on an even more alien quality. The trees grew at impossible angles, their branches intertwining in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The undergrowth rustled constantly with unseen movement, and occasionally I caught glimpses of pale shapes darting between the trunks just at the edge of my vision. The temperature fluctuated wildly and without warning. One moment I would be sweating in oppressive heat, the next shivering as frost formed on the nearby vegetation. Time seemed to behave erratically as well. The sun would suddenly jump across the sky, or shadows would move in directions that defied its position. And still no sign of Bear. By what felt like late afternoon but could have been any time, I was becoming genuinely panicked about my dog. I stopped on a ridge that should have offered a view of the surrounding forest and shouted his name until my throat was raw. David stood beside me, that perpetual smile fixed on his face, and when I turned to him for support, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. He cast no shadow. The late-day sun was hitting us directly, throwing my own shadow sharp and dark across the rocky ground, but the space beside me where David stood remained unmarked. I stared at the spot where his shadow should have been, my mind struggling to process this impossibility. "Sarah?" David's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he stood right beside me. "Are you feeling all right?" I looked up at his face and felt reality tilt sideways. His features were the same, but somehow they didn't fit together properly anymore. His eyes were set too far apart, his mouth was too wide, and when he smiled I could see far too many teeth, sharp, irregular teeth that belonged in the mouth of something that had never been human. "Where's my dog?" I demanded, backing away from him. David's impossible grin widened. "Oh, he's around. He's been watching us all day." As if summoned by his words, Bear emerged from the forest below us. But one look at my beloved companion confirmed my worst fears. This thing wearing Bear's shape moved wrong. Its gait was stiff and unnatural, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a real dog's neck. Its amber eyes had been replaced with flat black voids that reflected nothing. It climbed toward us with mechanical precision, never breaking its unnatural gait, never pausing to sniff or investigate as the real bear would have done. When it reached us, it sat at David's feet with perfect, horrible stillness. "Good boy," David said, reaching down to pat its head. His hand passed through the creature's skull as if it were made of smoke. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothes and pack, my only thought to get as far as possible from the things that had been pretending to be David and Bear. Behind me I could hear pursuit, not the sound of footsteps, but something much worse. It was the sound of the forest itself giving chase, trees creaking and branches snapping in a wave of unnatural movement that followed me wherever I went. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning in this twisted version of the Oregon wilderness. The sun flickered overhead like a strobe light, casting the forest in alternating moments of blazing brightness and impenetrable shadow. The ground beneath my feet changed from rocky soil to marsh to snow to something that squelched wetly and gave off the stench of rotting meat. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I found myself in a small grove where the trees grew in a perfect circle, their trunks smooth and white as bone. In the center of the circle lay my tent, fully assembled exactly as I had left it that morning. This was impossible. I had packed the tent myself, stuffed it into my backpack along with the rest of my gear. But there it sat, stake ropes properly tensioned, rain fly secured, my sleeping bag visible through the open flap. I approached cautiously, every survival instinct screaming warnings I couldn't understand. The tent looked exactly right in every detail, but something about it felt fundamentally wrong, like a perfectly crafted replica that missed some essential quality of the original. Inside the tent, I found my sleeping bag unzipped from the inside and spread open as if someone had recently vacated it. The fabric was still warm to the touch, and when I bent closer, I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach heave, the sweet, cloying smell of advanced decay. That's when I heard Bear barking, not the mechanical thing that had sat beside David, but my real dog, somewhere in the forest around the grove. His barks were frantic and desperate, the sound of an animal in mortal terror. I followed the sound, crashing through the ring of bone-white trees, and found him trapped in a depression between two fallen logs. It was definitely Bear. I could tell by the way he moved, the familiar tilt of his head, the desperate joy in his eyes when he saw me. But something had been done to him. His beautiful copper coat was now streaked with white that formed patterns too regular to be natural, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I reached for him, he bit me. Bear had never bitten a human being in his life, but his teeth sank deep into my forearm, tearing through my jacket and into the flesh beneath. The pain was shocking, but worse was the look in his eyes as he did it, a pleading, desperate expression that seemed to be begging me to understand something he couldn't communicate. Then he released me and backed away, whimpering. The patterns on his coat writhed more visibly now, and I realized they weren't just markings, they were moving, burrowing through his fur like living things. Bear's whimpers became screams, high-pitched sounds of agony that no dog should be capable of making. I watched in horror as my beloved companion convulsed and changed. His limbs elongated impossibly. His spine curved into a configuration that belonged to no earthly creature, and his beautiful amber eyes rolled back in his skull until only the whites showed. The things moving through his coat burst free, revealing themselves as pale, segmented worms that immediately began burrowing into the earth around his transformed body. When the convulsions stopped, the creature that had been Bear raised its head and fixed me with a gaze of pure, alien hatred. Its mouth opened far too wide, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth, and it spoke with a voice like grinding glass. "Sarah, Help. Me. But it wasn't asking for help. It was mocking me with the memory of my dog's trust, using his voice to make the violation complete. I ran again, this time with no thought of direction or destination. The forest had become a nightmare landscape where physics held no meaning, and every shadow might hide something wearing the face of someone I loved. Tree roots reached for my ankles like grasping fingers. Branches formed barriers that forced me along predetermined paths, and always behind me came the sound of that thing that had been Bear, calling my name in perfect imitation of my dog's voice. Night fell again with the same unnatural speed, and I found myself stumbling through absolute darkness. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by a blackness so complete it felt solid. I was operating on pure adrenaline now, my rational mind having shut down completely in the face of impossibilities it couldn't process. That's when I saw the lights. They danced between the trees ahead of me, warm, yellow glows that promised civilization and safety. I stumbled toward them, tears of relief streaming down my face until I emerged into another clearing and found the source of the lights. They were eyes. Dozens of pairs of golden eyes, all perfectly round and unblinking, staring at me from the darkness beyond the clearing. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, figures began to detach themselves from the shadows. They had the rough shape of humans, but their proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with joints that bent in directions that hurt to observe. One of them stepped into the clearing's center, and I recognized David's face grafted onto this impossible frame. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself had learned to mimic human speech. "You're lost, Sarah. You've been lost since the moment you left the real trail. This is our forest now, our hunting ground. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone carrying so much pain, so much emptiness. It makes the wearing so much easier." "Wearing," I whispered. "We need forms that can walk in your world. Faces that won't arouse suspicion. The dog was perfect practice, but we require something more sophisticated for our real work." More figures emerged from the tree line. Dozens of them, all wearing faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew were stolen. Men, women, children, even animals, all moving with that same wrong gait, all staring at me with those terrible golden eyes. "We've been feeding on the pain that brought you here," David's voice continued. "Your divorce, your failing career, your mother's deteriorating mind. Such exquisite suffering. But now we need something more permanent." The circle of creatures began to close around me, and I realized that my bite wound from Bear was burning with an unnatural heat. Looking down, I saw that the skin around the punctures was beginning to change, taking on a pale, segmented appearance like the worms that had emerged from my dog's coat. "The change has already begun," David said, and his stolen face split into that too wide grin. "Soon you'll understand. Soon you'll see how much better it is to be empty, to be free of all that human pain." But the pain was all I had left. The pain of loss, of failure, of watching my life fall apart piece by piece. It was the only thing that still felt real in this nightmare landscape, and suddenly I understood that this was the key. I pressed my hands against the bite wound, focusing on the burning sensation, using it to anchor myself to reality. The creatures hesitated, their golden eyes flickering with uncertainty. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The pain is mine." I thought about my mother, struggling to remember my face. I thought about my ex-husband, about the photos I'd never taken, about my dog, my real dog, and the trust I'd failed to protect. The agony was overwhelming, but it was human agony, real and raw and uncompromisingly mine. The forest began to shiver around us, the trees swaying without wind, the ground rippling like water. The creatures' stolen faces started to blur and shift, revealing glimpses of the horrible truth beneath. "The pain is mine," I repeated, louder this time. "You can't have it. You can't have me." David's face melted like wax, revealing something that had never been human underneath. The other creatures began to shriek in voices like breaking glass, their forms dissolving back into shadow and nightmare. The forest collapsed. I found myself lying in the actual clearing where I'd originally made camp, surrounded by the familiar and wonderfully normal trees of the Mount Hood wilderness. My tent was gone, my pack was missing, and I was wearing clothes I didn't remember putting on. But the morning sun was shining through a canopy that looked exactly the way an Oregon forest should look. My phone had signal again. According to the timestamp, it was November 8th. I'd been missing for 5 days. I never found Bear's body, though search and rescue teams spent 3 days combing the area where I claimed to have lost him. The official report stated that I'd suffered a psychotic break brought on by stress and hypothermia, and that I'd wandered in circles for days before collapsing from exhaustion. They found evidence of a dog attack. The bite wounds on my arm were real enough, but no trace of any animal. The wound became infected despite treatment, and the scar tissue grew in patterns that remind me uncomfortably of the symbols I saw moving through Bear's coat. I never went back to the wilderness. I sold my camera equipment, moved across the country, and now I work in an office building where I can see other people at all times. I take medication that helps with the nightmares, and I see a therapist twice a week who specializes in trauma recovery. But sometimes, in crowded places, I catch sight of a face that doesn't quite fit properly. Eyes that are set too far apart, or a smile that reveals too many teeth. And I know that somewhere in the Oregon wilderness, they're still hunting, still wearing stolen faces, still looking for travelers who carry enough pain to make the process easier. I've tried to warn people, but who would believe such a story? Instead, I write these words as a record, a testament to what really happened during those 5 days in November. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 33 years old now. I survived something in the Mount Hood wilderness that shouldn't exist, and I live every day knowing that part of me is still trapped in that forest of bone-white trees, still running from things that wear the faces of everyone I've ever loved. The worst part is the doubt. In my rational moments, I can almost convince myself that the doctors are right, that trauma and hypothermia created elaborate hallucinations. But then I look at the scar on my arm, at the way it seems to writhe and shift when I'm not looking directly at it, and I remember the truth. Something in those woods is still wearing my dog's face, still calling my name in his voice, still waiting for me to come back. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I almost want to.